dark, the strange presence stalks a remote campsite, tied to an ancient and primal fear. 140 case the camp of the Dark-Eye Islands of all shapes and sizes troop northward from Stockholm by the hundred, and the little steamer that threads their intricate mazes in summer leaves the traveler in a somewhat bewildered state as regards the points of the compass when it reaches the end of its journey at Waxholm. But it is only after Waxholm that the true islands begin, so to speak, to run wild and start up the coast on their tangled course of 100 miles of deserted loveliness. And it was in the very heart of this delightful confusion that we pitched our tents for a summer holiday. A veritable wilderness of islands lay about us, from the mere round button of a rock that bore a single fir to the mountainous stretch of a square mile, densely wooded and bounded by precipitous cliffs, so close together often that a strip of water ran between no wider than a country lane, or again, so far that an expanse stretched like the open sea for miles. Although the larger islands boasted farms and fishing stations, the majority were uninhabited. Carpeted with moss and heather, their coastlines showed a series of ravines and clefts and little sandy bays, with a growth of splendid pinewoods that came down to the water's edge and led the eye through unknown depths of shadow and mystery into the very heart of primitive forest. The particular islands to which we had camping rights, by virtue of paying a nominal sum to a Stockholm 241 merchant, lay together in a picturesque group far beyond the reach of the steamer, one being a mere reef with a fringe of fairy-like birches, and two others, cliff-bound monsters rising with wooded heads out of the sea. The fourth, which we selected because it enclosed a little lagoon suitable for anchorage, bathing, night lines, and whatnot, shall have what description is necessary as the story proceeds. But so far as paying rent was concerned, we might equally well have pitched our tents on any one of 100 others that clustered about us as thickly as a swarm of bees. It was in the blaze of an evening in July, the air clear as crystal, the sea a cobalt blue, when we left the steamer on the borders of civilization and sailed away with maps, compasses, and provisions for the little group of darts in the Skegard that were to be our home for the next 2 months. The dinghy and my Canadian canoe trailed behind us, with tents and dunnage carefully piled aboard, and when the point of cliff intervened to hide the steamer and the Waxholm Hotel, we realized for the first time that the horror of trains and houses was far behind us, the fever of men and cities, the weariness of streets and confined spaces. The wilderness opened up on all sides into endless blue reaches, and the map and compasses were so frequently called into requisition that we went astray more often than not, and progress was enchantingly slow. It took us, for instance, 2 whole days to find our crescent-shaped home, and the camps we made on the way were so fascinating that we left them with difficulty and regret, for each island seemed more desirable than the one before it, and over all lay the spell of haunting peace, remoteness from the turmoil of the world, and the freedom of open and desolate spaces. And so many of these spots of world beauty have I sought out and dwelt in, that in my mind remains only a composite memory of their faces, a true map of heaven, as it were, from which this particular one stands forth with unusual sharpness, because of the strange things that 242 happened there, and also, I think, because anything in which John's silence played a part has a habit of fixing itself in the mind with a living and lasting quality of vividness. For the moment, however, Dr. Silence was not of the party. Some private case in the interior of Hungary claimed his attention, and it was not till later, the 15th of August, to be exact, that I had arranged to meet him in Berlin and then return to London together for our harvest of winter work. All the members of our party, however, were known to him more or less well, and on this third day, as we sailed through the narrow opening into the lagoon and saw the circular ridge of trees in a gold and crimson sunset before us, his last words to me when we parted in London, for some unaccountable reason, came back very sharply to my memory and recalled the curious impression of prophecy with which I had first heard them. "Enjoy your holiday and store up all the force you can," he had said as the train slipped out of Victoria, "and we will meet in Berlin on the 15th, unless you should send for me sooner." And now suddenly the words returned to me so clearly that it seemed I almost heard his voice in my ear, "unless you should send for me sooner," and returned, moreover, with a significance I was wholly at a loss to understand, that touched somewhere in the depths of my mind a vague sense of apprehension that they had all along been intended in the nature of a prophecy. In the lagoon, then, the wind failed us this July evening, as was only natural behind the shelter of the belt of woods, and we took to the oars, all breathless with the beauty of this first sight of our island home, yet all talking in somewhat hushed voices of the best place to land, the depth of water, the safest place to anchor, to put up the tents in, the most sheltered spot for the campfires, and a dozen things of importance that crop up when a home in the wilderness has actually to be made. And during this busy sunset hour of unloading before the dark, the souls of my companions adopted the trick of 243, presenting themselves very vividly anew before my mind, and introducing themselves afresh. In reality, I suppose, our party was in no sense singular. In the conventional life at home, they certainly seemed ordinary enough. But suddenly, as we passed through these gates of the wilderness, I saw them more sharply than before, with characters stripped of the atmosphere of men and cities. A complete change of setting often furnishes a startlingly new view of people hitherto held for well-known. They present another facet of their personalities. I seem to see my own party almost as new people, people I had not known properly hitherto, people who would drop all disguises and henceforth reveal themselves as they really were. And each one seemed to say, "Now you will see me as I am. You will see me here in this primitive life of the wilderness, without clothes. All my masks and veils I have left behind in the abodes of men. So look out for surprises." The Reverend Timothy Maloney helped me to put up the tents, long practice making the process easy, and while he drove in pegs and tightened ropes, his coat off, his flannel collar flying open without a tie, it was impossible to avoid the conclusion that he was cut out for the life of a pioneer rather than the church. He was 50 years of age, muscular, blue-eyed and hardy, and he took his share of the work and more without shirking. The way he handled the axe in cutting down saplings for the tent poles was a delight to see, and his eye in judging the level was unfailing. Bullied as a young man into a lucrative family living, he had in turn bullied his mind into some semblance of orthodox beliefs, doing the honors of the little country church with an energy that made one think of a coal heaver tending china. And it was only in the past few years that he had resigned the living and taken instead to cramming young men for their examinations. This suited him better. It enabled him, too, to indulge his passion for spells of wild life, and to spend the summer months of 244 most years under canvas in one part of the world or another, where he could take his young men with him and combine reading with open air. His wife usually accompanied him, and there was no doubt she enjoyed the trips, for she possessed, though in less degree, the same joy of the wilderness that was his own distinguishing characteristic. The only difference was that while he regarded it as the real life, she regarded it as an interlude. While he camped out with his heart and mind, she played at camping out with her clothes and body. Nonetheless, she made a splendid companion, and to watch her busy cooking dinner over the fire we had built among the stones was to understand that her heart was in the business for the moment, and that she was happy even with the detail. Mrs. Maloney at home, knitting in the sun and believing that the world was made in 6 days, was one woman, but Mrs. Maloney, standing with bare arms over the smoke of a wood fire under the pine trees, was another. And Peter Sangre, the Canadian pupil with his pale skin and his loose, though not ungainly figure, stood beside her in very unfavorable contrast as he scraped potatoes and sliced bacon with slender white fingers that seemed better suited to hold a pen than a knife. She ordered him about like a slave, and he obeyed, too, with willing pleasure, for in spite of his general appearance of debility, he was as happy to be in camp as any of them. But more than any other member of the party, Joan Maloney, the daughter, was the one who seemed a natural and genuine part of the landscape, who belonged to it all just in the same way that the trees and the moss and the grey rocks running out into the water belonged to it. For she was obviously in her right and natural setting, a creature of the wilds, a gypsy in her own home. To anyone with a discerning eye this would have been more or less apparent, but to me, who had known her during all the 22 years of her life, and was familiar with the ins and outs of her primitive, utterly unmodern 245 type, it was strikingly clear. To see her, there made it impossible to imagine her again in civilization. I lost all recollection of how she looked in a town. The memory somehow evaporated. This slim creature before me, flitting to and fro with the grace of the woodland life, swift, supple, adroit, on her knees blowing the fire, or stirring the frying pan through a veil of smoke, suddenly seemed the only way I had ever really seen her. Here she was at home. In London she became someone concealed by clothes, an artificial doll overdressed and moving by clockwork, only a portion of her alive. Here she was alive all over. I forget altogether how she was dressed, just as I forget how any particular tree was dressed, or how the markings ran on any one of the boulders that lay about the camp. She looked just as wild and natural and untamed as everything else that went to make up the scene, and more than that I cannot say. Pretty, she was decidedly not. She was thin, skinny, dark-haired, and possessed of great physical strength in the form of endurance. She had, too, something of the force and vigorous purpose of a man, tempestuous sometimes and wild to passionate, frightening her mother and puzzling her easygoing father with her storms of waywardness, while at the same time she stirred his admiration by her violence. A pagan of the pagans she was besides, and with some haunting suggestion of old-world pagan beauty about her dark face and eyes. Altogether an odd and difficult character, but with a generosity and high courage that made her very lovable. In town life she always seemed to me to feel cramped, bored, a devil in a cage. In her eyes a hunted expression, as though any moment she dreaded to be caught. But up in these spacious solitudes all this disappeared. Away from the limitations that plagued and stung her, she would show at her best, and as I watched her moving about the camp, I repeatedly found myself thinking of a 246 wild creature that had just obtained its freedom and was trying its muscles. Peter Sangri, of course, at once went down before her, but she was so obviously beyond his reach, and besides so well able to take care of herself, that I think her parents gave the matter but little thought, and he himself worshipped at a respectful distance, keeping admirable control of his passion in all respects save one. For at his age the eyes are difficult to master, and the yearning, almost the devouring, expression often visible in them was probably there unknown even to himself. He, better than anyone else, understood that he had fallen in love with something most hard of attainment, something that drew him to the very edge of life, and almost beyond it. It no doubt was a secret and terrible joy to him, this passionate worship from afar. Only I think he suffered more than anyone guessed, and that his want of vitality was due in large measure to the constant stream of unsatisfied yearning that poured forever from his soul and body. Moreover, it seemed to me, who now saw them for the first time together, that there was an unnameable something, an elusive quality of some kind, that marked them as belonging to the same world, and that although the girl ignored him, she was secretly, and perhaps unknown to herself, drawn by some attribute very deep in her own nature to some quality equally deep in his. This, then, was the party when we first settled down into our 2 months' camp on the island in the Baltic Sea. Other figures flitted from time to time across the scene, and sometimes one reading man, sometimes another, came to join us and spend his 4 hours a day in the clergyman's tent, but they came for short periods only, and they went without leaving much trace in my memory, and certainly they played no important part in what subsequently happened. The weather favored us that night, so that by sunset the tents were up, the boats unloaded, a store of wood collected and chopped into lengths, and the candle 247 lanterns hung round ready for lighting on the trees. Sangri, too, had picked deep mattresses of balsam boughs for the women's beds, and had cleared little paths of brushwood from their tents to the central fireplace. All was prepared for bad weather. It was a cozy supper, and a well-cooked one, that we sat down to and ate under the stars, and according to the clergyman, the only meal fit to eat we had seen since we left London a week before. The deep stillness, after that roar of steamers, trains, and tourists, held something that thrilled, for as we lay round the fire there was no sound but the faint sighing of the pines and the soft lapping of the waves along the shore and against the sides of the boat in the lagoon. The ghostly outline of her white sails was just visible through the trees, idly rocking to and fro in her calm anchorage, her sheets flapping gently against the mast. Beyond lay the dim blue shapes of other islands floating in the night, and from all the great spaces about us came the murmur of the sea and the soft breathing of great woods. The odors of the wilderness, smells of wind and earth, of trees and water, clean, vigorous, and mighty, were the true odors of a virgin world unspoilt by men, more penetrating and more subtly intoxicating than any other perfume in the whole world. Oh, and dangerously strong too, no doubt, for some natures. Ah, breathed out the clergyman after supper, with an indescribable gesture of satisfaction and relief. Here there is freedom, and room for body and mind to turn in. Here one can work and rest and play. Here one can be alive, and absorb something of the earth forces that never get within touching distance in the cities. By George, I shall make a permanent camp here and come when it is time to die. The good man was merely giving vent to his delight at being under canvas. He said the same thing every year, and he said it often, but it more or less expressed the superficial feelings of us all. And when, a little later, he turned to compliment his wife on the fried potatoes, and 248 discovered that she was snoring with her back against a tree, He grunted with content at the sight and put a ground sheet over her feet, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for her to fall asleep after dinner, and then moved back to his own corner, smoking his pipe with great satisfaction. And I, smoking mine too, lay and fought against the most delicious sleep imaginable, while my eyes wandered from the fire to the stars peeping through the branches, and then back again to the group about me. The Rev. Timothy soon let his pipe go out, and succumbed as his wife had done, for he had worked hard and eaten well. Sangri, also smoking, leaned against a tree with his gaze fixed on the girl, a depth of yearning in his face that he could not hide, and that really distressed me for him. And Joan herself, with wide staring eyes, alert, full of the new forces of the place, evidently keyed up by the magic of finding herself among all the things her soul recognized as home, sat rigid by the fire, her thoughts roaming through the spaces, the blood stirring about her heart. She was as unconscious of the Canadian's gaze as she was that her parents both slept. She looked to me more like a tree or something that had grown out of the island than a living girl of the century. And when I spoke across to her in a whisper and suggested a tour of investigation, she started and looked up at me as though she heard a voice in her dreams. Sangri leaped up and joined us, and without waking the others, we three went over the ridge of the island and made our way down to the shore behind. The water lay like a lake before us, still colored by the sunset. The air was keen and scented, wafting the smell of the wooded islands that hung about us in the darkening air. Very small waves tumbled softly on the sand. The sea was sown with stars, and everywhere breathed and pulsed the beauty of the northern summer night. I confess I speedily lost consciousness of the human presences beside me, and I have little doubt Joan did too. Only Sangri felt otherwise, 249 I suppose, for presently we heard him sighing, and I can well imagine that he absorbed the whole wonder and passion of the scene into his aching heart, to swell the pain there that was more searching even than the pain at the sight of such matchless and incomprehensible beauty. The splash of a fish jumping broke the spell. "I wish we had the canoe now," remarked Joan. "We could paddle out to the other islands." "Of course," I said. "Wait here and I'll go across for it," and was turning to feel my way back through the darkness when she stopped me in a voice that meant what it said. "No, Mr. Sangri will get it. We will wait here and cooey to guide him." The Canadian was off in a moment, for she had only to hint of her wishes and he obeyed. "Keep out from shore in case of rocks," I cried out as he went, and turned to the right out of the lagoon. "That's the shortest way round by the map." My voice traveled across the still waters and woke echoes in the distant islands that came back to us like people calling out of space. It was only 30 or 40 yards over the ridge and down the other side to the lagoon where the boats lay, but it was a good mile to coast round the shore in the dark to where we stood and waited. We heard him stumbling away among the boulders, and then the sounds suddenly ceased as he topped the ridge and went down past the fire on the other side. I didn't want to be left alone with him, the girl said presently in a low voice. "I'm always afraid he's going to say or do something." She hesitated a moment, looking quickly over her shoulder towards the ridge where he had just disappeared, something that might lead to unpleasantness. She stopped abruptly. "You frightened Joan," I exclaimed with genuine surprise. "This is a new light on your wicked character. I 250 thought the human being who could frighten you did not exist." Then I suddenly realized she was talking seriously, looking to me for help of some kind, and at once I dropped the teasing attitude. "He's very far gone, I think, Joan," I added gravely. "You must be kind to him, whatever else you may feel. He's exceedingly fond of you." "I know, but I can't help it," she whispered, lest her voice should carry in the stillness. "There's something about him that makes me feel creepy and half afraid. But poor man, it's not his fault if he is delicate and sometimes looks like death." I laughed gently, by way of defending what I felt to be a very innocent member of my sex. "Oh, but it's not that I mean," she answered quickly. "It's something I feel about him, something in his soul, something he hardly knows himself, but that may come out if we are much together. It draws me, I feel, tremendously. It stirs what is wild in me deep down, oh, very deep down, yet at the same time makes me feel afraid. I suppose his thoughts are always playing about you," I said, "but he's nice-minded and—" "Yes, yes," she interrupted impatiently. "I can trust myself absolutely with him. He's gentle and singularly pure-minded. But there's something else that—" She stopped again sharply to listen. Then she came up close beside me in the darkness, whispering, "You know, Mr. Hubbard, sometimes my intuitions warn me a little too strongly to be ignored. Oh, yes, you needn't tell me again that it's difficult to distinguish between fancy and intuition. I know all that, but I also know that there's something deep down in that man's soul that calls to something deep down in mine. And at present it frightens me, because I cannot make out what it is. And I know, he'll do something someday 251 that will shake my life to the very bottom. She laughed a little at the strangeness of her own description. I turned to look at her more closely, but the darkness was too great to show her face. There was an intensity, almost of suppressed passion, in her voice that took me completely by surprise. "Nonsense, Joan," I said a little severely. "You know him well. He's been with your father for months now. But that was in London, and up here it's different. I mean, I feel that it may be different. Life in a place like this blows away the restraints of the artificial life at home. I know what I'm saying. I feel all untied in a place like this. The rigidity of one's nature begins to melt and flow. Surely you must understand what I mean." "Of course I understand," I replied, yet not wishing to encourage her in her present line of thought. "And it's a grand experience for a short time. But you're overtired tonight, Joan, like the rest of us. A few days in this air will set you above all fears of the kind you mention." Then, after a moment's silence, I added, feeling I should estrange her confidence altogether if I blundered any more and treated her like a child, "I think, perhaps, the true explanation is that you pity him for loving you, and at the same time you feel the repulsion of the healthy, vigorous animal for what is weak and timid. If he came up boldly and took you by the throat and shouted that he would force you to love him, well, then you would feel no fear at all. You would know exactly how to deal with him. Isn't it perhaps something of that kind?" The girl made no reply, and when I took her hand I felt that it trembled a little and was cold. "It's not his love that I'm afraid of," she said hurriedly, for at this moment we heard the dip of a paddle in the water. "It's something in his very soul that terrifies me in a way I have never been terrified before, yet fascinates me. In town, I was hardly conscious of his presence, but the moment we got away from civilization, it began to 252 come. He seems so real up here. I dread being alone with him. It makes me feel that something must burst and tear its way out, that he would do something, or I should do something. I don't know exactly what I mean, probably, but that I should let myself go and scream." "Joan, don't be alarmed," she laughed shortly. "I shan't do anything silly, but I wanted to tell you my feelings in case I needed your help. When I have intuitions as strong as this, they are never wrong, only I don't know yet what it means exactly. You must hold out for the month, at any rate," I said in as matter-of-fact a voice as I could manage, for her manner had somehow changed my surprise to a subtle sense of alarm. "Sangri only stays the month, you know. And anyhow, you are such an odd creature yourself that you should feel generously towards other odd creatures." I ended lamely, with a forced laugh. She gave my hand a sudden pressure. "I'm glad I've told you at any rate," she said quickly under her breath, for the canoe was now gliding up silently like a ghost to our feet. "And I'm glad you're here too," she added as we moved down towards the water to meet it. I made Sangri change into the bows and got into the steering seat myself, putting the girl between us so that I could watch them both by keeping their outlines against the sea and stars. For the intuitions of certain folk, women and children usually, I confess, I have always felt a great respect that has more often than not been justified by experience. And now the curious emotion stirred in me by the girl's words remained somewhat vividly in my consciousness. I explained it in some measure by the fact that the girl, tired out by the fatigue of many days' travel, had suffered a vigorous reaction of some kind from the strong, desolate scenery, and further, perhaps, that she had been treated to my own experience of seeing the members of the party in a new light. The Canadian, being partly a stranger, more vividly than the 253 rest of us. But at the same time, I felt it was quite possible that she had sensed some subtle link between his personality and her own, some quality that she had hitherto ignored, and that the routine of town life had kept buried out of sight. The only thing that seemed difficult to explain was the fear she had spoken of, and this, I hoped the wholesome effects of camp life and exercise would sweep away naturally in the course of time. We made the tour of the island without speaking. It was all too beautiful for speech. The trees crowded down to the shore to hear us pass. We saw their fine dark heads, bowed low with splendid dignity to watch us, forgetting for a moment that the stars were caught in the needled network of their hair. Against the sky in the west, where still lingered the sunset gold, we saw the wild toss of the horizon, shaggy with forest and cliff, gripping the heart like the motive in a symphony and sending the sense of beauty all a-shiver through the mind. All these surrounding islands standing above the water like low clouds, and like them seeming to post along silently into the engulfing night. We heard the musical drip-drip of the paddle and the little wash of our waves on the shore, and then suddenly we found ourselves at the opening of the lagoon again, having made the complete circuit of our home. The Reverend Timothy had awakened from sleep and was singing to himself, and the sound of his voice as we glided down the 50 yards of enclosed water was pleasant to hear and undeniably wholesome. We saw the glow of the fire up among the trees on the ridge, and his shadow moving about as he threw on more wood. "There you are," he called aloud. "Good again. Been setting the night lines, eh? Capital. And your mother's still fast asleep, Joan." His cheery laugh floated across the water. He had not been in the least disturbed by our absence, for old campers are not easily alarmed. 254. "Now, remember," he went on, after we had told our little tale of travel by the fire, and Mrs. Maloney had asked for the 4th time exactly where her tent was and whether the door faced east or south. "Everyone takes their turn at cooking breakfast, and one of the men is always out at sunrise to catch it first. Hubbard, I'll toss you which you do in the morning and which I do." He lost the toss. "Then I'll catch it," I said, laughing at his discomfiture, for I knew he loathed stirring porridge. "And mind you don't burn it, as you did every blessed time last year on the Volga," I added by way of reminder. Mrs. Maloney's 5th interruption about the door of her tent, and her further pointed observation that it was past 9 o'clock, set us lighting lanterns and putting the fire out for safety. But before we separated for the night, the clergyman had a time-honored little ritual of his own to go through that no one had the heart to deny him. He always did this. It was a relic of his pulpit habits. He glanced briefly from one to the other of us, his face grave and earnest, his hands lifted to the stars, and his eyes all closed and puckered up beneath a momentary frown. Then he offered up a short, almost inaudible prayer, thanking heaven for our safe arrival, begging for good weather, no illness or accidents, plenty of fish and strong sailing winds. And then, unexpectedly, no one knew why exactly, he ended up with an abrupt request that nothing from the kingdom of darkness should be allowed to afflict our peace, and no evil thing come near to disturb us in the night time. And while he uttered these last surprising words, so strangely unlike his usual ending, it chanced that I looked up and let my eyes wander round the group assembled about the dying fire, and it certainly seemed to me that Sangre's face underwent a sudden and visible alteration. He was staring at Joan, and as he stared the change ran over it like a shadow and was gone. I started in spite of 255 myself, for something oddly concentrated, potent, collected, had come into the expression usually so scattered and feeble, but it was all swift as a passing meteor, and when I looked a second time his face was normal, and he was looking among the trees, and Joan, luckily, had not observed him, her head being bowed and her eyes tightly closed while her father prayed. The girl has a vivid imagination indeed, I thought, half laughing as I lit the lanterns, if her thoughts can put a glamour upon mine in this way. And yet somehow, when we said good night, I took occasion to give her a few vigorous words of encouragement, and went to her tent to make sure I could find it quickly in the night, in case anything happened. In her quick way, the girl understood and thanked me, and the last thing I heard, as I moved off to the men's quarters, was Mrs. Maloney crying that there were beetles in her tent, and Joan's laughter as she went to help her turn them out. Half an hour later the island was silent as the grave, but for the mournful voices of the wind as it sighed up from the sea. Like white sentries stood the 3 tents of the men on one side of the ridge, and on the other side, half hidden by some birches, whose leaves just shivered as the breeze caught them, the women's tents, patches of ghostly grey, gathered more closely together for mutual shelter and protection. Something like 50 yards of broken ground, grey rock, moss and lichen, lay between, and over all lay the curtain of the night and the great whispering winds from the forests of Scandinavia. And the very last thing, just before floating away on that mighty wave that carries one so softly off into the deeps of forgetfulness, I again heard the voice of John Silence as the train moved out of Victoria Station. And by some subtle connection that met me on the very threshold of consciousness, there rose in my mind simultaneously the memory of the girl's half-given confidence and of her distress. As by some wizardry of 256 approaching dreams, they seemed in that instant to be related. But before I could analyze the why and the wherefore, both sank away out of sight again, and I was off beyond recall. Unless you should send for me sooner. Roman 2, whether Mrs. Maloney's tent door opened south or east, I think she never discovered, for it is quite certain she always slept with the flap tightly fastened. I only know that my own little 5x7 all silk faced due east, because next morning the sun, pouring in as only the wilderness sun knows how to pour, woke me early, and a moment later, with a short run over soft moss and a flying dive from the granite ledge, I was swimming in the most sparkling water imaginable. It was barely 4 o'clock, and the sun came down a long vista of blue islands that led out to the open sea and Finland. Nearer by rose the wooded domes of our own property, still capped and wreathed with smoky trails of fast-melting mist, and looking as fresh as though it was the morning of Mrs. Maloney's 6th day, and they had just issued, clean and brilliant, from the hands of the great architect. In the open spaces, the ground was drenched with dew, and from the sea a cool salt wind stole in among the trees and set the branches trembling in an atmosphere of shimmering silver. The tents shone white where the sun caught them in patches. Below lay the lagoon, still dreaming of the summer night. In the open, the fish were jumping busily, sending musical ripples towards the shore, and in the air hung the magic of dawn, silent, incommunicable. 257, I lit the fire, so that an hour later the clergyman should find good ashes to stir his porridge over, and then set forth upon an examination of the island. But hardly had I gone a dozen yards when I saw a figure standing a little in front of me where the sunlight fell in a pool among the trees. It was Joan. She had already been up an hour, she told me, and had bathed before the last stars had left the sky. I saw at once that the new spirit of this solitary region had entered into her, banishing the fears of the night, for her face was like the face of a happy denizen of the wilderness, and her eyes stainless and shining. Her feet were bare, and drops of dew she had shaken from the branches hung in her loose flying hair. Obviously, she had come into her own. "I've been all over the island," she announced laughingly, "and there are 2 things wanting. You're a good judge, Joan. What are they? There's no animal life, and there's no water." "They go together," I said. "Animals don't bother with a rock like this unless there's a spring on it." And as she led me from place to place, happy and excited, leaping adroitly from rock to rock, I was glad to note that my first impressions were correct. She made no reference to our conversation of the night before. The new spirit had driven out the old. There was no room in her heart for fear or anxiety, and nature had everything her own way. The island, we found, was some 3/4 of a mile from point to point, built in a circle or wide horseshoe, with an opening of 20 feet at the mouth of the lagoon. Pine trees grew thickly all over, but here and there were patches of silver birch, scrub oak, and considerable colonies of wild raspberry and gooseberry bushes. The 2 ends of the horseshoe formed bare slabs of smooth granite running into the sea and forming dangerous reefs just below the surface. But the rest of the island rose in a 40-foot ridge and sloped down steeply 258 to the sea on either side, being nowhere more than 100 yards wide. The outer shoreline was much indented with numberless coves and bays and sandy beaches, with here and there caves and precipitous little cliffs against which the sea broke in spray and thunder. But the inner shore, the shore of the lagoon, was low and regular, and so well protected by the wall of trees along the ridge that no storm could ever send more than a passing ripple along its sandy marges. Eternal shelter reigned there. On one of the other islands, a few hundred yards away, for the rest of the party slept late this first morning, and we took to the canoe, we discovered a spring of fresh water untainted by the brackish flavor of the Baltic. And having thus solved the most important problem of the camp, we next proceeded to deal with the second, fish. And in half an hour we reeled in and turned homewards, for we had no means of storage, and to clean more fish than may be stored or eaten in a day is no wise occupation for experienced campers. And as we landed towards 6 o'clock, we heard the clergyman singing as usual, and saw his wife and Sangri shaking out their blankets in the sun, and dressed in a fashion that finally dispelled all memories of streets and civilization. "The little people lit the fire for me," cried Maloney, looking natural and at home in his ancient flannel suit and breaking off in the middle of his singing. "So I've got the porridge going, and this time it's not burnt." We reported the discovery of water and held up the fish. "Good, good again," he cried. "We'll have the first decent breakfast we've had this year. Sangri'll clean 'em in no time, and the barson's mate will fry them to a turn," laughed the voice of Mrs. Maloney, appearing on the scene in a tight blue jersey and sandals, and catching up the frying pan. Her husband always called her the barson's mate in camp, 259, because it was her duty, among others, to pipe all hands to meals. "And as for you, Joan," went on the happy man, "you look like the spirit of the island, with moss in your hair and wind in your eyes, and sun and stars mixed in your face. He looked at her with delighted admiration. "Here, Sangri, take these 12. There's a good fellow. They are the biggest. And we'll have 'em in butter in less time than you can say Baltic Island." I watched the Canadian as he slowly moved off to the cleaning pail. His eyes were drinking in the girl's beauty, and a wave of passionate, almost feverish, joy passed over his face, expressive of the ecstasy of true worship more than anything else. Perhaps he was thinking that he still had 3 weeks to come with that vision, always before his eyes. Perhaps he was thinking of his dreams in the night. I cannot say, but I noticed the curious mingling of yearning and happiness in his eyes, and the strength of the impression touched my curiosity. Something in his face held my gaze for a second, something to do with its intensity. That so timid, so gentle a personality should conceal so virile a passion almost seemed to require explanation. But the impression was momentary, for that first breakfast in camp permitted no divided attentions, and I dare swear that the porridge, the tea, the Swedish flatbread, and the fried fish flavored with points of frizzled bacon were better than any meal eaten elsewhere that day in the whole world. The first clear day in a new camp is always a furiously busy one, and we soon dropped into the routine upon which in large measure the real comfort of everyone depends. About the cooking fire, greatly improved with stones from the shore, we built a high stockade consisting of upright poles thickly twined with branches, the roof lined with moss and lichen and weighted with rocks, and round the interior we made low wooden seats so that we could lie round the fire even in rain and eat our meals in 260 peace. Paths, too, outlined themselves from tent to tent, from the bathing places and the landing stage, and a fair division of the island was decided upon between the quarters of the men and the women. Wood was stacked, awkward trees and boulders removed, hammocks slung and tents strengthened. In a word, camp was established, and duties were assigned and accepted as though we expected to live on this Baltic island for years to come, and the smallest detail of the community life was important. Moreover, as the camp came into being, this sense of a community developed, proving that we were a definite whole, and not merely separate human beings living for a while in tents upon a desert island. Each fell willingly into the routine. Sangri, as by natural selection, took upon himself the cleaning of the fish and the cutting of the wood into lengths sufficient for a day's use. And he did it well. The pan of water was never without a fish, cleaned and scaled, ready to fry for whoever was hungry. The nightly fire never died down for lack of material to throw on without going farther afield to search. And Timothy, once reverend, caught the fish and chopped down the trees. He also assumed responsibility for the condition of the boat, and did it so thoroughly that nothing in the little cutter was ever found wanting. And when, for any reason, his presence was in demand, the first place to look for him was in the boat, and there, too, he was usually found, tinkering away with sheets, sails, or rudder and singing as he tinkered. Nor was the reading neglected, for most mornings there came a sound of droning voices from the white tent by the raspberry bushes, which signified that Sangri, the tutor, and whatever other man chanced to be in the party at the time, were hard at it with history or the classics. And while Mrs. Maloney, also by natural selection, took charge of the larder and the kitchen, the mending and general supervision of the rough comforts, she also made herself peculiarly mistress of the megaphone, which 261 summoned to meals, and carried her voice easily from one end of the island to the other. And in her hours of leisure, she daubed the surrounding scenery on to a sketching block with all the honesty and devotion of her determined but unreceptive soul. Joan, meanwhile, Joan, elusive creature of the wilds, became I know not exactly what. She did plenty of work in the camp, yet seemed to have no very precise duties. She was everywhere and anywhere. Sometimes she slept in her tent, sometimes under the stars with a blanket. She knew every inch of the island and kept turning up in places where she was least expected, forever wandering about, reading her books in sheltered corners, making little fires on sunless days to worship by to the gods. As she put it, ever finding new pools to dive and bathe in, and swimming day and night in the warm and waveless lagoon like a fish in a huge tank. She went bare-legged and barefooted, with her hair down and her skirts caught up to the knees, and if ever a human being turned into a jarly savage within the compass of a single week, Joan Maloney was certainly that human being. She ran wild, so completely, too, was she possessed by the strong spirit of the place, that the little human fear she had yielded to so strangely on our arrival seemed to have been utterly dispossessed. As I hoped and expected, she made no reference to our conversation of the first evening. Sangri bothered her with no special attentions, and after all, they were very little together. His behavior was perfect in that respect, and I, for my part, hardly gave the matter another thought. Joan was ever a prey to vivid fancies of one kind or another, and this was one of them. Mercifully, for the happiness of all concerned, it had melted away before the spirit of busy, active life and deep content that reigned over the island. Everyone was intensely alive, and peace was upon all. 262. Meanwhile, the effect of the camp life began to tell. Always a searching test of character, its results, sooner or later, are infallible, for it acts upon the soul as swiftly and surely as the hypo bath upon the negative of a photograph. A readjustment of the personal forces takes place quickly. Some parts of the personality go to sleep, others wake up. But the first sweeping change that the primitive life brings about is that the artificial portions of the character shed themselves one after another like dead skins. Attitudes and poses that seemed genuine in the city drop away. The mind, like the body, grows quickly hard, simple, uncomplex, and in a camp as primitive and close to nature as ours was, these effects became speedily visible. Some folk, of course, who talk glibly about the simple life when it is safely out of reach, betray themselves in camp by forever peering about for the artificial excitements of civilization which they miss. Some get bored at once, some grow slovenly, some reveal the animal in most unexpected fashion, and some, the select few, find themselves in very short order and are happy. And in our little party, we could flatter ourselves that we all belonged to the last category, so far as the general effect was concerned. Only there were certain other changes as well, varying with each individual, and all interesting to note. It was only after the first week or two that these changes became marked, although this is the proper place, I think, to speak of them. For having myself no other duty than to enjoy a well-earned holiday, I used to load my canoe with blankets and provisions and journey forth on exploration trips among the islands of several days together. And it was on my return from the first of these, when I rediscovered the party, so to speak, that these changes first presented themselves vividly to me, and in one particular instance produced a rather curious impression. 263. In a word, then, while everyone had grown wilder, naturally wilder, Sangri, it seemed to me, had grown much wilder, and what I can only call unnaturally wilder. He made me think of a savage. To begin with, he had changed immensely in mere physical appearance, and the full brown cheeks, the brighter eyes of absolute health, and the general air of vigor and robustness that had come to replace his customary lassitude and timidity, had worked such an improvement that I hardly knew him for the same man. His voice, too, was deeper, and his manner bespoke, for the first time, a greater measure of confidence in himself. He now had some claims to be called nice-looking, or at least to a certain air of virility that would not lessen his value in the eyes of the opposite sex. All this, of course, was natural enough and most welcome, but altogether apart from this physical change, which no doubt had also been going forward in the rest of us, there was a subtle note in his personality that came to me with a degree of surprise that almost amounted to shock. And two things, as he came down to welcome me and pull up the canoe, leaped up in my mind unbidden, as though connected in some way I could not at the moment divine. First, the curious judgment formed of him by Joan, and secondly, that fugitive expression I had caught in his face, while Maloney was offering up his strange prayer for special protection from heaven. The delicacy of manner and feature, to call it by no milder term, which had always been a distinguishing characteristic of the man, had been replaced by something far more vigorous and decided, that yet utterly eluded analysis. The change which impressed me so oddly was not easy to name. The others, singing Maloney, the bustling bosun's mate, and Joan, that fascinating half-breed of Undine and Salamander, all showed the effects of a life so close to nature. But in their case the change was perfectly natural, and what was to be 264 expected, whereas with Peter Sangri, the Canadian, it was something unusual and unexpected. It is impossible to explain how he managed gradually to convey to my mind the impression that something in him had turned savage. Yet this, more or less, is the impression that he did convey. It was not that he seemed really less civilized, or that his character had undergone any definite alteration, but rather that something in him, hitherto dormant, had awakened to life. Some quality, latent till now, so far at least, as we were concerned, who after all knew him but slightly, had stirred into activity and risen to the surface of his being. And while, for the moment, this seemed as far as I could get, it was but natural that my mind should continue the intuitive process, and acknowledge that John's silence, owing to his peculiar faculties, and the girl, owing to her singularly receptive temperament, might each in a different way have divined this latent quality in his soul and feared its manifestation later. On looking back to this painful adventure, too, it now seems equally natural that the same process, carried to its logical conclusion, should have wakened some deep instinct in me that, wholly without direction from my will, set itself sharply and persistently upon the watch from that very moment. Thenceforward, the personality of Sangri was never far from my thoughts, and I was forever analyzing and searching for the explanation that took so long in coming. "I declare, Hubbard, you're tanned like an aboriginal, and you look like one too," laughed Maloney. "And I can return the compliment," was my reply, as we all gathered round a brew of tea to exchange news and compare notes. And later, at supper, it amused me to observe that the distinguished Tudor, once clergyman, did not eat his food quite as nicely as he did at home. He devoured it, that Mrs. Maloney ate more, and to say the least with less delay than was her custom in the select atmosphere of 265 her English dining room, and that while Joan attacked her tin plateful with genuine avidity, Sangri, the Canadian, bit and gnawed at his, laughing and talking and complimenting the cook all the while, and making me think with secret amusement of a starved animal at its first meal. While, from their remarks about myself, I judged that I had changed and grown wild as much as the rest of them. In this and in 100 other little ways the change showed, ways difficult to define in detail, but all proving, not the coarsening effect of leading the primitive life, but let us say, the more direct and unvarnished methods that became prevalent. For all day long we were in the bath of the elements, wind, water, sun, and just as the body became insensible to cold and shed unnecessary clothing, the mind grew straightforward and shed many of the disguises required by the conventions of civilization. And in each, according to temperament and character, there stirred the life instincts that were natural, untamed, and, in a sense, savage. Roman 3, so it came about that I stayed with our island party, putting off my second exploring trip from day to day, and I think that this far-fetched instinct to watch Sangri was really the cause of my postponement. For another 10 days the life of the camp pursued its even and delightful way, blessed by perfect summer weather, a good harvest of fish, fine winds for sailing, and calm, starry nights. Maloney's selfish prayer had been favorably received. Nothing came to disturb or perplex. There was not even the prowling of night animals to vex the rest of Mrs. Maloney, for in previous camps it had often been her peculiar affliction that she heard the 266 porcupines scratching against the canvas, or the squirrels dropping fir cones in the early morning with a sound of miniature thunder upon the roof of her tent. But on this island there was not even a squirrel or a mouse. I think 2 toads and a small and harmless snake were the only living creatures that had been discovered during the whole of the first fortnight. And these 2 toads, in all probability, were not 2 toads, but 1 toad. Then suddenly came the terror that changed the whole aspect of the place, the devastating terror. It came, at first, gently, but from the very start it made me realize the unpleasant loneliness of our situation, our remote isolation in this wilderness of sea and rock, and how the islands in this tideless Baltic Ocean lay about us like the advance guard of a vast besieging army. Its entry, as I say, was gentle, hardly noticeable, in fact, to most of us. Singularly undramatic it certainly was. But then, in actual life, this is often the way the dreadful climaxes move upon us, leaving the heart undisturbed almost to the last minute, and then overwhelming it with a sudden rush of horror. For it was the custom at breakfast to listen patiently while each in turn related the trivial adventures of the night, how they slept, whether the wind shook their tent, whether the spider on the ridge pole had moved, whether they had heard the toad, and so forth. And on this particular morning Joan, in the middle of a little pause, made a truly novel announcement. "In the night I heard the howling of a dog," she said, and then flushed up to the roots of her hair when we burst out laughing. For the idea of there being a dog on this forsaken island that was only able to support a snake and 2 toads was distinctly ludicrous. And I remember Maloney, halfway through his burnt porridge, capping the announcement by declaring that he had heard a Baltic turtle in the lagoon, and his wife's expression of frantic alarm before the laughter undeceived her. But the next morning, Joan repeated the story with additional and convincing detail. 267 sounds of whining and growling woke me, she said, and I distinctly heard sniffing under my tent and the scratching of paws. "Oh, Timothy, can it be a porcupine?" exclaimed the boatswain's mate with distress, forgetting that Sweden was not Canada. But the girl's voice had sounded to me in quite another key, and looking up, I saw that her father and Sangri were staring at her hard. They, too, understood that she was in earnest, and had been struck by the serious note in her voice. "Rubbish, Joan. You are always dreaming something or other wild," her father said a little impatiently. "There's not an animal of any size on the whole island," added Sangri with a puzzled expression. He never took his eyes from her face. "But there's nothing to prevent one swimming over," I put in briskly, for somehow a sense of uneasiness that was not pleasant had woven itself into the talk and pauses. "A deer, for instance, might easily land in the night and take a look round. Or a bear," gasped the boatswain's mate, with a look so portentous that we all welcomed the laugh. But Joan did not laugh. Instead, she sprang up and called to us to follow. "There," she said, pointing to the ground by her tent on the side farthest from her mother's. "There are the marks close to my head. You can see for yourselves." We saw plainly. The moss and lichen, for earth there was hardly any, had been scratched up by paws. An animal about the size of a large dog it must have been, to judge by the marks. We stood and stared in a row. "Close to my head," repeated the girl, looking round at us. Her face, I noticed, was very pale, and her lips seemed to quiver for an instant. Then she gave a sudden gulp and burst into a flood of tears. The whole thing had come about in the brief space of a few minutes, and with a curious sense of inevitableness. 268, moreover, as though it had all been carefully planned from all time and nothing could have stopped it. It had all been rehearsed before, had actually happened before, as the strange feeling sometimes has it. It seemed like the opening movement in some ominous drama, and that I knew exactly what would happen next. Something of great moment was impending, for this sinister sensation of coming disaster made itself felt from the very beginning, and an atmosphere of gloom and dismay pervaded the entire camp from that moment forward. I drew Sangri to one side and moved away, while Maloney took the distressed girl into her tent, and his wife followed them, energetic and greatly flustered. For thus, in undramatic fashion, it was that the terror I have spoken of first attempted the invasion of our camp, and trivial and unimportant though it seemed, every little detail of this opening scene is photographed upon my mind with merciless accuracy and precision. It happened exactly as described. This was exactly the language used. I see it written before me in black and white. I see, too, the faces of all concerned with the sudden ugly signature of alarm, where before had been peace. The terror had stretched out, so to speak, a first tentative feeler toward us, and had touched the hearts of each with a horrid directness. And from this moment the camp changed. Sangri in particular was visibly upset. He could not bear to see the girl distressed, and to hear her actually cry was almost more than he could stand. The feeling that he had no right to protect her hurt him keenly, and I could see that he was itching to do something to help, and liked him for it. His expression said plainly that he would tear in 1,000 pieces anything that dared to injure a hair of her head. We lit our pipes and strolled over in silence to the men's quarters, and it was his odd Canadian expression, "Gee whiz," that drew my attention to a further discovery. 269, "The brute's been scratching round my tent too," he cried, as he pointed to similar marks by the door, and I stooped down to examine them. We both stared in amazement for several minutes without speaking. "Only I sleep like the dead," he added, straightening up again, "and so heard nothing, I suppose." We traced the paw marks from the mouth of his tent in a direct line across to the girls, but nowhere else about the camp was there a sign of the strange visitor. The deer, dog, or whatever it was that had twice favored us with a visit in the night, had confined its attentions to these two tents. And after all, there was really nothing out of the way about these visits of an unknown animal, for although our own island was destitute of life, we were in the heart of a wilderness, and the mainland and larger islands must be swarming with all kinds of four-footed creatures, and no very prolonged swimming was necessary to reach us. In any other country, it would not have caused a moment's interest of the kind we felt, that is. In our Canadian camps, the bears were forever grunting about among the provision bags at night, porcupines scratching unceasingly, and chipmunks scuttling over everything. "My daughter is overtired, and that's the truth of it," explained Maloney presently when he rejoined us and had examined in turn the other paw marks. "She's been overdoing it lately, and camp life, you know, always means a great excitement to her. It's natural enough. If we take no notice, she'll be all right." He paused to borrow my tobacco pouch and fill his pipe, and the blundering way he filled it and spilled the precious weed on the ground visibly belied the calm of his easy language. "You might take her out for a bit of fishing, Hubbard, like a good chap. She's hardly up to the long day in the cutter. Show her some of the other islands in your canoe, perhaps." And by lunchtime the cloud had passed away as suddenly and as suspiciously as it had come. 270, but in the canoe on our way home, having till then purposely ignored the subject uppermost in our minds, she suddenly spoke to me in a way that again touched the note of sinister alarm. The note that kept on sounding and sounding until finally John's silence came with his great vibrating presence and relieved it. Yes, and even after he came too, for a while. I'm ashamed to ask it, she said abruptly, as she steered me home, her sleeves rolled up, her hair blowing in the wind, and ashamed of my silly tears too, because I really can't make out what caused them. But Mr. Hubbard, I want you to promise me not to go off for your long expeditions, just yet. I beg it of you. She was so in earnest that she forgot the canoe, and the wind caught it sideways and made us roll dangerously. I have tried hard not to ask this, she added, bringing the canoe round again, but I simply can't help myself. It was a good deal to ask, and I suppose my hesitation was plain, for she went on before I could reply, and her beseeching expression and intensity of manner impressed me very forcibly. For another 2 weeks only, Mr. Sangri leaves in a fortnight, I said, seeing at once what she was driving at, but wondering if it was best to encourage her or not. If I knew you were to be on the island till then, she said, her face alternately pale and blushing, and her voice trembling a little, I should feel so much happier. I looked at her steadily, waiting for her to finish. And safer, she added almost in a whisper, especially at night, I mean. Safer, Joan, I repeated, thinking I had never seen her eyes so soft and tender. She nodded her head, keeping her gaze fixed on my face. It was really difficult to refuse, whatever my thoughts and judgment may have been, and somehow I understood that she spoke with good reason, though for the life of me I could not have put it into words. 271, happier and safer, she said gravely, the canoe giving a dangerous lurch as she leaned forward in her seat to catch my answer. Perhaps, after all, the wisest way was to grant her request and make light of it, easing her anxiety without too much encouraging its cause. All right, Joan, you queer creature, I promise. And the instant look of relief in her face, and the smile that came back like sunlight to her eyes, made me feel that, unknown to myself and the world, I was capable of considerable sacrifice after all. But you know, there's nothing to be afraid of, I added sharply, and she looked up in my face with the smile women use when they know we are talking idly, yet do not wish to tell us so. You don't feel afraid, I know, she observed quietly. Of course not, why should I? So, if you will just humor me this once, I will never ask anything foolish of you again as long as I live, she said gratefully. You have my promise, was all I could find to say. She headed the nose of the canoe for the lagoon lying 1/4 of a mile ahead, and paddled swiftly. But a minute or two later she paused again and stared hard at me with the dripping paddle across the thwarts. You've not heard anything at night yourself, have you? She asked. I never hear anything at night, I replied shortly, from the moment I lie down till the moment I get up. That dismal howling, for instance, she went on, determined to get it out, far away at first and then getting closer and stopping just outside the camp. Certainly not, because sometimes I think I almost dreamed it. Most likely you did, was my unsympathetic response. And you don't think Father has heard it either, then? No, he would have told me if he had. This seemed to relieve her mind a little. I know Mother hasn't, she added, as if speaking to herself, for she 272 hears nothing ever. It was 2 nights after this conversation that I woke out of deep sleep and heard sounds of screaming. The voice was really horrible, breaking the peace and silence with its shrill clamor. In less than 10 seconds, I was half dressed and out of my tent. The screaming had stopped abruptly, but I knew the general direction and ran as fast as the darkness would allow over to the women's quarters, and on getting close, I heard sounds of suppressed weeping. It was Joan's voice, and just as I came up, I saw Mrs. Maloney, marvelously attired, fumbling with a lantern. Other voices became audible in the same moment behind me, and Timothy Maloney arrived, breathless, less than half-dressed, and carrying another lantern that had gone out on the way from being banged against a tree. Dawn was just breaking, and a chill wind blew in from the sea. Heavy black clouds drove low overhead. The scene of confusion may be better imagined than described. Questions in frightened voices filled the air against this background of suppressed weeping. Briefly, Joan's silk tent had been torn, and the girl was in a state bordering upon hysterics. Somewhat reassured by our noisy presence, however, for she was plucky at heart, she pulled herself together and tried to explain what had happened, and her broken words, told there on the edge of night and morning upon this wild island ridge, were oddly thrilling and distressingly convincing. Something touched me and I woke, she said simply, but in a voice still hushed and broken with the terror of it. Something pushing against the tent. I felt it through the canvas. There was the same sniffing and scratching as before, and I felt the tent give a little as when wind shakes it. I heard breathing, very loud, very heavy breathing, and then came a sudden great tearing blow, and the canvas ripped open close to my face. 273, she had instantly dashed out through the open flap and screamed at the top of her voice, thinking the creature had actually got into the tent. But nothing was visible, she declared, and she heard not the faintest sound of an animal making off under cover of the darkness. The brief account seemed to exercise a paralyzing effect upon us all as we listened to it. I can see the disheveled group to this day, the wind blowing the women's hair, and Maloney craning his head forward to listen, and his wife, open-mouthed and gasping, leaning against a pine tree. "Come over to the stockade and we'll get the fire going," I said. "That's the first thing," for we were all shaking with the cold in our scanty garments. And at that moment, Sangri arrived wrapped in a blanket and carrying his gun. He was still drunken with sleep. "The dog again," Maloney explained briefly, forestalling his questions. "Been at Joan's tent. Torn it, by gad. This time, it's time we did something." He went on mumbling confusedly to himself. Sangri gripped his gun and looked about swiftly in the darkness. I saw his eyes aflame in the glare of the flickering lanterns. He made a movement as though to start out and hunt and kill. Then his glance fell on the girl crouching on the ground, her face hidden in her hands, and there leaped into his features an expression of savage anger that transformed them. He could have faced a dozen lions with a walking stick at that moment, and again I liked him for the strength of his anger, his self-control, and his hopeless devotion. But I stopped him going off on a blind and useless chase. "Come and help me start the fire, Sangri," I said, anxious also to relieve the girl of our presence. And a few minutes later the ashes, still growing from the night's fire, had kindled the fresh wood, and there was a blaze that warmed us well, while it also lit up the surrounding trees within a radius of 20 yards. 274, I heard nothing, he whispered. "What in the world do you think it is? It surely can't be only a dog." "We'll find that out later," I said, as the others came up to the grateful warmth. "The first thing is to make as big a fire as we can." Joan was calmer now, and her mother had put on some warmer and less miraculous garments, and while they stood talking in low voices, Maloney and I slipped off to examine the tent. There was little enough to see, but that little was unmistakable. Some animal had scratched up the ground at the head of the tent, and with a great blow of a powerful paw, a paw clearly provided with good claws, had struck the silk and torn it open. There was a hole large enough to pass a fist and arm through. "It can't be far away," Maloney said excitedly. "We'll organize a hunt at once, this very minute." We hurried back to the fire, Maloney talking boisterously about his proposed hunt. "There's nothing like prompt action to dispel alarm," he whispered in my ear, and then turned to the rest of us. "We'll hunt the island from end to end at once," he said with excitement. "That's what we'll do. The beast can't be far away, and the Barson's mate and Joan must come too, because they can't be left alone. Hubbard, you take the right shore, and you, Sangri, the left, and I'll go in the middle with the women. In this way we can stretch clean across the ridge, and nothing bigger than a rabbit can possibly escape us." He was extraordinarily excited, I thought. Anything affecting Joan, of course, stirred him prodigiously. "Get your guns and we'll start the drive at once," he cried. He lit another lantern and handed one each to his wife and Joan, and while I ran to fetch my gun, I heard him singing to himself with the excitement of it all. Meanwhile, the dawn had come on quickly. It made the flickering lanterns look pale. The wind, too, was rising, and I heard the trees moaning overhead and the waves breaking with increasing clamor on the shore. In the lagoon the boat dipped and splashed, and the sparks from 275, the fire, were carried aloft in a stream and scattered far and wide. We made our way to the extreme end of the island, measured our distances carefully, and then began to advance. None of us spoke. Sangri and I, with cocked guns, watched the shore lines, and all within easy touch and speaking distance. It was a slow and blundering drive, and there were many false alarms, but after the best part of half an hour we stood on the farther end, having made the complete tour, and without putting up so much as a squirrel. Certainly there was no living creature on that island but ourselves. "I know what it is," cried Maloney, looking out over the dim expanse of grey sea and speaking with the air of a man making a discovery. "It's a dog from one of the farms on the larger islands." He pointed seawards where the archipelago thickened, "and it's escaped and turned wild. Our fires and voices attracted it, and it's probably half-starved as well as savage, poor brute." No one said anything in reply, and he began to sing again very low to himself. The point where we stood, a huddled, shivering group, faced the wider channels that led to the open sea and Finland. The grey dawn had broken in earnest at last, and we could see the racing waves with their angry crests of white. The surrounding islands showed up as dark masses in the distance, and in the east, almost as Maloney spoke, the sun came up with a rush in a stormy and magnificent sky of red and gold. Against this splashed and gorgeous background, black clouds, shaped like fantastic and legendary animals, filed past swiftly in a tearing stream, and to this day I have only to close my eyes to see again that vivid and hurrying procession in the air. All about us the pines made black splashes against the sky. It was an angry sunrise. Rain, indeed, had already begun to fall in big drops. We turned, as by a common instinct, and without speech, made our way back slowly to the stockade, 276 Maloney humming snatches of his songs, Sangri in front with his gun, prepared to shoot at a moment's notice, and the women floundering in the rear with myself and the extinguished lanterns. Yet it was only a dog. Really, it was most singular when one came to reflect soberly upon it all. Events, say the occultists, have souls, or at least that agglomerate life due to the emotions and thoughts of all concerned in them, so that cities and even whole countries have great astral shapes which may become visible to the eye of vision. And certainly here, the soul of this drive, this vain, blundering, futile drive, stood somewhere between ourselves and laughed. All of us heard that laugh, and all of us tried hard to smother the sound, or at least to ignore it. Everyone talked at once, loudly, and with exaggerated decision, obviously trying to say something plausible against heavy odds, striving to explain naturally that an animal might so easily conceal itself from us, or swim away before we had time to light upon its trail. For we all spoke of that trail, as though it really existed, and we had more to go upon than the mere marks of paws about the tents of Joan and the Canadian. Indeed, but for these, and the torn tent, I think it would, of course, have been possible to ignore the existence of this beast intruder altogether. And it was here, under this angry dawn, as we stood in the shelter of the stockade from the pouring rain, weary yet so strangely excited, it was here, out of this confusion of voices and explanations, that, very stealthily, the ghost of something horrible slipped in and stood among us. It made all our explanations seem childish and untrue. The false relation was instantly exposed. Eyes exchanged quick, anxious glances, questioning, expressive of dismay. There was a sense of wonder, of poignant distress, and of trepidation. Alarm stood waiting at our elbows. We shivered. Then, suddenly, as we looked into each other's faces, came the long, unwelcome pause in which this new arrival 277 established itself in our hearts. And without further speech or attempt at explanation, Maloney moved off abruptly to mix the porridge for an early breakfast, Sangri to clean the fish, myself to chop wood and tend the fire, Joan and her mother to change their wet garments, and most significant of all, to prepare her mother's tent for its future complement of two. Each went to his duty, but hurriedly, awkwardly, silently, and this new arrival, this shape of terror and distress, stalked, viewless, by the side of each. If only I could have traced that dog, I think was the thought in the minds of all. But in camp, where everyone realizes how important the individual contribution is to the comfort and well-being of all, the mind speedily recovers tone and pulls itself together. During the day, a day of heavy and ceaseless rain, we kept more or less to our tents, and though there were signs of mysterious conferences between the three members of the Maloney family, I think that most of us slept a good deal and stayed alone with his thoughts. Certainly I did, because when Maloney came to say that his wife invited us all to a special tea in her tent, he had to shake me awake before I realized that he was there at all. And by supper time, we were more or less even-minded again, and almost jolly. I only noticed that there was an undercurrent of what is best described as jumpiness, and that the merest snapping of a twig or plop of a fish in the lagoon was sufficient to make us start and look over our shoulders. Pauses were rare in our talk, and the fire was never for one instant allowed to get low. The wind and rain had ceased, but the dripping of the branches still kept up an excellent imitation of a downpour. In particular, Maloney was vigilant and alert, telling us a series of tales in which the wholesome, humorous element was especially strong. He lingered, too, behind with me after Sangri had gone to bed, and while I mixed myself 278 a glass of hot Swedish punch, he did a thing I had never known him do before. He mixed one for himself, and then asked me to light him over to his tent. We said nothing on the way, but I felt that he was glad of my companionship. I returned alone to the stockade, and for a long time after that kept the fire blazing and sat up smoking and thinking. I hardly knew why, but sleep was far from me for one thing, and for another, an idea was taking form in my mind that required the comfort of tobacco and a bright fire for its growth. I lay against a corner of the stockade seat, listening to the wind whispering and to the ceaseless drip-drip of the trees. The night otherwise was very still, and the sea quiet as a lake. I remember that I was conscious, peculiarly conscious, of this host of desolate islands crowding about us in the darkness, and that we were the one little spot of humanity in a rather wonderful kind of wilderness. But this, I think, was the only symptom that came to warn me of highly strung nerves, and it certainly was not sufficiently alarming to destroy my peace of mind. One thing, however, did come to disturb my peace, for just as I finally made ready to go and had kicked the embers of the fire into a last effort, I fancied I saw, peering at me round the farther end of the stockade wall, a dark and shadowy mass that strongly resembled, in fact, the body of a large animal. Two glowing eyes shone for an instant in the middle of it, but the next second I saw that it was merely a projecting mass of moss and lichen in the wall of our stockade, and the eyes were a couple of wandering sparks from the dying ashes I had kicked. It was easy enough, too, to imagine I saw an animal moving here and there between the trees as I picked my way stealthily to my tent. Of course, the shadows tricked me, and though it was after 1 o'clock, Maloney's light was still burning, for I saw his tent shining white among the pines. 279. It was, however, in the short space between consciousness and sleep, that time when the body is low and the voices of the submerged region tell sometimes true, that the idea which had been all this while maturing reached the point of an actual decision, and I suddenly realized that I had resolved to send word to Dr. Silence, for with a sudden wonder that I had hitherto been so blind, the unwelcome conviction dawned upon me all at once that some dreadful thing was lurking about us on this island, and that the safety of at least one of us was threatened by something monstrous and unclean that was too horrible to contemplate. And again, remembering those last words of his as the train moved out of the platform, I understood that Dr. Silence would hold himself in readiness to come. "Unless you should send for me sooner," he had said. I found myself suddenly wide awake. It is impossible to say what woke me, but it was no gradual process, seeing that I jumped from deep sleep to absolute alertness in a single instant. I had evidently slept for an hour and more, for the night had cleared, stars crowded the sky, and a pallid half-moon just sinking into the sea threw a spectral light between the trees. I went outside to sniff the air and stood upright. A curious impression that something was astir in the camp came over me, and when I glanced across at Sangri's tent, some 20 feet away, I saw that it was moving. He too, then, was awake and restless, for I saw the canvas sides bulge this way and that as he moved within. The flap pushed forward. He was coming out like myself to sniff the air, and I was not surprised, for its sweetness after the rain was intoxicating, and he came on all fours, just as I had done. I saw a head thrust round the edge of the tent, and then I saw that it was not Sangri at all. It was an animal, and the same instant I realized something else. 282. It was the animal, and its whole presentment for some unaccountable reason was unutterably malefic. A cry I was quite unable to suppress escaped me, and the creature turned on the instant and stared at me with baleful eyes. I could have dropped on the spot, for the strength all ran out of my body with a rush. Something about it touched in me the living terror that grips and paralyzes. If the mind requires but the 10th of a second to form an impression, I must have stood there stark still for several seconds, while I seized the ropes for support and stared. Many and vivid impressions flashed through my mind, but not one of them resulted in action, because I was in instant dread that the beast any moment would leap in my direction and be upon me. Instead, however, after what seemed a vast period, it slowly turned its eyes from my face, uttered a low whining sound, and came out altogether into the open. Then, for the first time, I saw it in its entirety and noted two things. It was about the size of a large dog, but at the same time it was utterly unlike any animal that I had ever seen. Also, that the quality that had impressed me first as being malefic was really only its singular and original strangeness. Foolish as it may sound, and impossible as it is for me to adduce proof, I can only say that the animal seemed to me then to be not real. But all this passed through my mind in a flash, almost subconsciously, and before I had time to check my impressions or even properly verify them, I made an involuntary movement, catching the tight rope in my hand so that it twanged like a banjo string. And in that instant the creature turned the corner of Sangri's tent and was gone into the darkness. Then, of course, my senses in some measure returned to me, and I realized only one thing. It had been inside his tent. I dashed out, reached the door in half a dozen strides, and looked in. The Canadian, thank God, lay upon his bed of branches. His arm was stretched outside, across the 281 blankets, the fist tightly clenched, and the body had an appearance of unusual rigidity that was alarming. On his face there was an expression of effort, almost of painful effort, so far as the uncertain light permitted me to see, and his sleep seemed to be very profound. He looked, I thought, so stiff, so unnaturally stiff, and in some indefinable way, too, he looked smaller, shrunken. I called to him to wake, but called many times in vain. Then I decided to shake him, and had already moved forward to do so vigorously when there came a sound of footsteps padding softly behind me, and I felt a stream of hot breath burn my neck as I stooped. I turned sharply. The tent door was darkened, and something silently swept in. I felt a rough and shaggy body push past me, and knew that the animal had returned. It seemed to leap forward between me and Sangri, in fact, to leap upon Sangri, for its dark body hid him momentarily from view, and in that moment my soul turned sick and coward with a horror that rose from the very dregs and depths of life, and gripped my existence at its central source. The creature seemed somehow to melt away into him, almost as though it belonged to him and were a part of himself, but in the same instant, that instant of extraordinary confusion and terror in my mind, it seemed to pass over and behind him, and in some utterly unaccountable fashion it was gone. And the Canadian woke, and sat up with a start. "Quick, you fool," I cried in my excitement. "The beast has been in your tent, here at your very throat while you sleep like the dead. Up, man, get your gun. Only this second, it disappeared over there behind your head. Quick, or Joan." And somehow the fact that he was there, wide awake now, to corroborate me, brought the additional conviction to my own mind that this was no animal, but some perplexing and dreadful form of life that drew upon my deeper knowledge, that much reading had perhaps 282 assented to, but that had never yet come within actual range of my senses. He was up in a flash and out. He was trembling and very white. We searched hurriedly, feverishly, but found only the traces of paw marks passing from the door of his own tent across the moss to the women's, and the sight of the tracks about Mrs. Maloney's tent, where Joan now slept, set him in a perfect fury. "Do you know what it is, Hubbard, this beast?" he hissed under his breath at me. "It's a damned wolf, that's what it is, a wolf lost among the islands and starving to death, desperate. So help me God, I believe it's that." He talked a lot of rubbish in his excitement. He declared he would sleep by day and sit up every night until he killed it. Again his rage touched my admiration, but I got him away before he made enough noise to wake the whole camp. "I have a better plan than that," I said, watching his face closely. "I don't think this is anything we can deal with. I'm going to send for the only man I know who can help. We'll go to Waxholm this very morning and get a telegram through." Sangri stared at me with a curious expression as the fury died out of his face, and a new look of alarm took its place. "John Silence," I said, "will know. You think it's something of that sort," he stammered. "I am sure of it." There was a moment's pause. "That's worse, far worse than anything material," he said, turning visibly paler. He looked from my face to the sky, and then added with sudden resolution, "Come, the wind's rising. Let's get off at once. From there you can telephone to Stockholm and get a telegram sent without delay." I sent him down to get the boat ready, and seized the opportunity myself to run and wake Maloney. He was sleeping very lightly, and sprang up the moment I put my head inside his tent. I told him briefly what I had seen, 283, and he showed so little surprise that I caught myself wondering for the first time whether he himself had seen more going on than he had deemed wise to communicate to the rest of us. He agreed to my plan without a moment's hesitation, and my last words to him were to let his wife and daughter think that the great psychic doctor was coming merely as a chance visitor, and not with any professional interest. So, with frying pan, provisions, and blankets aboard, Sangri and I sailed out of the lagoon 15 minutes later, and headed with a good breeze for the direction of Waxholm and the borders of civilization. Roman 4, although nothing John Silence did ever took me, properly speaking, by surprise, it was certainly unexpected to find a letter from Stockholm waiting for me. "I have finished my Hungary business," he wrote, and am here for 10 days. Do not hesitate to send if you need me. If you telephone any morning from Waxholm, I can catch the afternoon steamer." My years of intercourse with him were full of coincidences of this description, and although he never sought to explain them by claiming any magical system of communication with my mind, I have never doubted that there actually existed some secret telepathic method by which he knew my circumstances and gauged the degree of my need, and that this power was independent of time in the sense that it saw into the future, always seemed to me equally apparent. Sangri was as much relieved as I was, and within an hour of sunset that very evening we met him on the arrival of the little coasting steamer, and carried him off in 284, the dinghy, to the camp we had prepared on a neighboring island, meaning to start for home early next morning. "Now," he said, when supper was over and we were smoking round the fire, "let me hear your story." He glanced from one to the other, smiling. "You tell it, Mr. Hubbard," Sangri interrupted abruptly, and went off a little way to wash the dishes, yet not so far as to be out of earshot. And while he splashed with the hot water and scraped the tin plates with sand and moss, my voice, unbroken by a single question from Doctor Silence, ran on for the next half-hour with the best account I could give of what had happened. My listener lay on the other side of the fire, his face half hidden by a big sombrero. Sometimes he glanced up questioningly when a point needed elaboration, but he uttered no single word till I had reached the end, and his manner all through the recital was grave and attentive. Overhead, the wash of the wind in the pine branches filled in the pauses. The darkness settled down over the sea, and the stars came out in thousands, and by the time I finished the moon had risen to flood the scene with silver. Yet by his face and eyes, I knew quite well that the doctor was listening to something he had expected to hear, even if he had not actually anticipated all the details. "You did well to send for me," he said very low, with a significant glance at me when I finished. "Very well," and for one swift second his eye took in Sangri, "for what we have to deal with here is nothing more than a werewolf, rare enough, I am glad to say, but often very sad, and sometimes very terrible." I jumped as though I had been shot, but the next second was heartily ashamed of my want of control, for this brief remark, confirming as it did my own worst suspicions, did more to convince me of the gravity of the adventure than any number of questions or explanations. It seemed to draw close the circle about us, shutting a door somewhere that locked us in with the animal and the 285 horror, and turning the key. Whatever it was had now to be faced and dealt with. "No one has been actually injured so far?" he asked aloud, but in a matter-of-fact tone that lent reality to grim possibilities. "Good heavens, no," cried the Canadian, throwing down his dishcloths and coming forward into the circle of firelight. "Surely there can be no question of this poor starved beast injuring anybody, can there?" His hair straggled untidily over his forehead, and there was a gleam in his eyes that was not all reflection from the fire. His words made me turn sharply. We all laughed a little short, forced laugh. "I trust not, indeed, Doctor," Silence said quietly. "But what makes you think the creature is starved?" He asked the question with his eyes straight on the other's face. The prompt question explained to me why I had started, and I waited with just a tremor of excitement for the reply. Sangri hesitated a moment, as though the question took him by surprise, but he met the doctor's gaze unflinchingly across the fire, and with complete honesty. "Really," he faltered with a little shrug of the shoulders, "I can hardly tell you." The phrase seemed to come out of its own accord. I have felt from the beginning that it was in pain and starved, though why I felt this never occurred to me till you asked. "You really know very little about it, then?" said the other, with a sudden gentleness in his voice. "No more than that," Sangri replied, looking at him with a puzzled expression that was unmistakably genuine. "In fact, nothing at all, really," he added, by way of further explanation. "I am glad of that," I heard the doctor murmur under his breath, but so low that I only just caught the words, and Sangri missed them altogether, as evidently he was meant to do. "And now," he cried, getting on his feet and shaking himself with a characteristic gesture, as though to shake 286 out the horror and the mystery, "let us leave the problem till tomorrow and enjoy this wind and sea and stars. I've been living lately in the atmosphere of many people, and feel that I want to wash and be clean. I propose a swim and then bed. Who'll second me?" And 2 minutes later we were all diving from the boat into cool, deep water that reflected 1,000 moons as the waves broke away from us in countless ripples. Open sky, Sangri and I taking the outside places, and were up before sunrise to catch the dawn wind. Helped by this early start, we were halfway home by noon, and then the wind shifted to a few points behind us so that we fairly ran. In and out among 1,000 islands, down narrow channels where we lost the wind, out into open spaces where we had to take in a reef, racing along under a hot and cloudless sky. We flew through the very heart of the bewildering and lonely scenery. "A real wilderness," cried Doctor, Silence from his seat in the bows where he held the jib sheet. His hat was off, his hair tumbled in the wind, and his lean brown face gave him the touch of an Oriental. Presently he changed places with Sangri, and came down to talk with me by the tiller. "A wonderful region, all this world of islands," he said, waving his hand to the scenery rushing past us. "But doesn't it strike you there's something lacking?" "It's hard," I answered after a moment's reflection. "It has a superficial, glittering prettiness. Without—" I hesitated to find the word I wanted. John Silence nodded his head with approval. "Exactly," he said, "the picturesqueness of stage scenery that is not real, not alive. It's like a landscape by a clever painter, yet without true imagination. Soulless, that's the word you wanted." "Something like that," I answered, watching the gusts of wind on the sails. "Not dead so much as without soul. That's it. 287, of course," he went on, in a voice calculated, it seemed to me, not to reach our companion in the bows. "To live long in a place like this, long and alone, might bring about a strange result in some men." I suddenly realized he was talking with a purpose and pricked up my ears. "There's no life here. These islands are mere dead rocks pushed up from below the sea, not living land. And there's nothing really alive on them. Even the sea, this tideless, brackish sea, neither salt water nor fresh, is dead. It's all a pretty image of life, without the real heart and soul of life. To a man with two strong desires who came here and lived close to nature, strange things might happen." "Let her out a bit," I shouted to Sangri, who was coming aft. "The wind's gusty and we've got hardly any ballast." He went back to the bows, and Doctor Silence continued. "Here, I mean, a long sojourn would lead to deterioration, to degeneration. The place is utterly unsoftened by human influences, by any humanizing associations of history, good or bad. This landscape has never awakened into life. It's still dreaming in its primitive sleep." "In time," I put in, "you mean a man living here might become brutal. The passions would run wild, selfishness become supreme, the instincts coarsen and turn savage probably. But in other places just as wild, parts of Italy for instance, where there are other moderating influences, it could not happen. The character might grow wild, savage too in a sense, but with a human wildness one could understand and deal with. But here, in a hard place like this, it might be otherwise." He spoke slowly, weighing his words carefully. I looked at him with many questions in my eyes, and a precautionary cry to Sangri to stay in the forepart of 288 the boat, out of earshot. First of all there would come callousness to pain, and indifference to the rights of others. Then the soul would turn savage, not from passionate human causes or with enthusiasm, but by deadening down into a kind of cold, primitive, emotionless savagery, by turning like the landscape soulless. And a man with strong desires, you say, might change. Without being aware of it, yes. He might turn savage, his instincts and desires turn animal. And if he lowered his voice and turned for a moment towards the bows, and then continued in his most weighty manner, owing to delicate health or other predisposing causes, his double, you know what I mean. Of course, his etheric body of desire, or astral body as some term it, that part in which the emotions, passions and desires reside, if this, I say, were for some constitutional reason loosely joined to his physical organism, there might well take place an occasional projection. Sangri came aft with a sudden rush, his face aflame, but whether with wind or sun, or with what he had RD, I cannot say. In my surprise, I let the tiller slip, and the cutter gave a great plunge as she came sharply into the wind and flung us all together in a heap on the bottom. Sangri said nothing, but while he scrambled up and made the jib sheet fast, my companion found a moment to add to his unfinished sentence the words, too low for any ear but mine, entirely unknown to himself, however. We righted the boat and laughed, and then Sangri produced the map and explained exactly where we were. Far away on the horizon, across an open stretch of water, lay a blue cluster of islands with our crescent-shaped home among them and the safe anchorage of the lagoon. An hour with this wind would get us there comfortably, and while Doctor Silence and Sangri fell into conversation, I sat and pondered over the strange suggestions that had 289 just been put into my mind concerning the double, and the possible form it might assume when dissociated temporarily from the physical body. The whole way home these two chatted, and John's silence was as gentle and sympathetic as a woman. I did not hear much of their talk, for the wind grew occasionally to the force of a hurricane, and the sails and tiller absorbed my attention. But I could see that Sangri was pleased and happy, and was pouring out intimate revelations to his companion in the way that most people did, when John's silence wished them to do so. But it was quite suddenly, while I sat all intent upon wind and sails, that the true meaning of Sangri's remark about the animal flared up in me with its full import. For his admission that he knew it was in pain and starved was in reality nothing more or less than a revelation of his deeper self. It was in the nature of a confession. He was speaking of something that he knew positively, something that was beyond question or argument, something that had to do directly with himself. Poor starved beast, he had called it in words that had come out of their own accord, and there had not been the slightest evidence of any desire to conceal or explain away. He had spoken instinctively, from his heart, and as though about his own self. And half an hour before sunset, we raced through the narrow opening of the lagoon and saw the smoke of the dinner fire blowing here and there among the trees, and the figures of Joan and the boatswain's mate running down to meet us at the landing stage. Everything changed from the moment John's silence set foot on that island. It was like the effect produced by 290 calling in some big doctor, some great arbiter of life and death, for consultation. The sense of gravity increased 100-fold. Even inanimate objects took upon themselves a subtle alteration. For the setting of the adventure, this deserted bit of sea with its hundreds of uninhabited islands somehow turned somber. An element that was mysterious, and in a sense disheartening, crept unbidden into the severity of grey rock and dark pine forest, and took the sparkle from the sunshine and the sea. I at least was keenly aware of the change, for my whole being shifted, as it were, a degree higher, becoming keyed up and alert. The figures from the background of the stage moved forward a little into the light, nearer to the inevitable action. In a word, this man's arrival intensified the whole affair, and looking back down the years to the time when all this happened, it is clear to me that he had a pretty sharp idea of the meaning of it from the very beginning. How much he knew beforehand by his strange divining powers, it is impossible to say, but from the moment he came upon the scene and caught within himself the note of what was going on amongst us, he undoubtedly held the true solution of the puzzle, and had no need to ask questions. And this certitude it was that set him in such an atmosphere of power and made us all look to him instinctively, for he took no tentative steps, made no false moves, and while the rest of us floundered, he moved straight to the climax. He was indeed a true diviner of souls. I can now read into his behavior a good deal that puzzled me at the time, for though I had dimly guessed the solution, I had no idea how he would deal with it. And the conversations I can reproduce almost verbatim, for, according to my invariable habit, I kept full notes of all he said. To Mrs. Maloney, foolish and dazed; to Joan, alarmed yet plucky; and to the clergyman, moved by his 291 daughters' distress below his usual shallow emotions, he gave the best possible treatment in the best possible way, yet all so easily and simply as to make it appear naturally spontaneous. For he dominated the boatswain's mate, taking the measure of her ignorance with infinite patience. He keyed up Joan, stirring her courage and interest to the highest point for her own safety, and the Reverend Timothy he soothed and comforted while obtaining his implicit obedience, by taking him into his confidence and leading him gradually to a comprehension of the issue that was bound to follow. And Sangri, here his wisdom was most wisely calculated. He neglected outwardly, because inwardly he was the object of his unceasing and most concentrated attention. Under the guise of apparent indifference, his mind kept the Canadian under constant observation. There was a restless feeling in the camp that evening, and none of us lingered round the fire after supper as usual. Sangri and I busied ourselves with patching up the torn tent for our guest, and with finding heavy stones to hold the ropes for Doctor. Silence insisted on having it pitched on the highest point of the island ridge, just where it was most rocky, and there was no earth for pegs. The place, moreover, was midway between the men's and women's tents, and of course commanded the most comprehensive view of the camp, so that if your dog comes, he said simply, I may be able to catch him as he passes across. The wind had gone down with the sun, and an unusual warmth lay over the island that made sleep heavy, and in the morning we assembled at a late breakfast, rubbing our eyes and yawning. The cool north wind had given way to the warm southern air that sometimes came up with haze and moisture across the Baltic, bringing with it the relaxing sensations that produced enervation and listlessness. And this may have been the reason why at first I failed to notice that anything unusual was about, and why I was 292 less alert than normally. For it was not till after breakfast that the silence of our little party struck me, and I discovered that Joan had not yet put in an appearance. And then, in a flash, the last heaviness of sleep vanished, and I saw that Maloney was white and troubled, and his wife could not hold a plate without trembling. A desire to ask questions was stopped in me by a swift glance from Dr. Silence, and I suddenly understood in some vague way that they were waiting till Sangri should have gone. How this idea came to me I cannot determine, but the soundness of the intuition was soon proved, for the moment he moved off to his tent, Maloney looked up at me and began to speak in a low voice. "You slept through it all," he half whispered. "Through what?" I asked, suddenly thrilled with the knowledge that something dreadful had happened. "We didn't wake you for fear of getting the whole camp up," he went on, meaning, by the camp, I supposed Sangri. "It was just before dawn when the screams woke me." "The dog again?" I asked, with a curious sinking of the heart. "Got right into the tent," he went on, speaking passionately but very low, "and woke my wife by scrambling all over her. Then she realized that Joan was struggling beside her. And by God, the beast had torn her arm, scratched all down the arm she was, and bleeding." "Joan injured?" I gasped. "Merely scratched this time," put in John Silence, speaking for the first time, suffering more from shock and fright than actual wounds. "Isn't it a mercy the doctor was here?" said Mrs. Maloney, looking as if she would never know calmness again. "I think we should both have been killed." "It has been a most merciful escape," Maloney said, his pulpit voice struggling with his emotion. "But of course, 293, we cannot risk another. We must strike camp and get away at once. Only poor Mr. Sangri must not know what has happened. He is so attached to Joan and would be so terribly upset," added the bosun's mate distractedly, looking all about in her terror. "It is perhaps advisable that Mr. Sangri should not know what has occurred," Dr. Silence said with quiet authority, "but I think, for the safety of all concerned, it will be better not to leave the island just now." He spoke with great decision, and Maloney looked up and followed his words closely. "If you will agree to stay here a few days longer, I have no doubt we can put an end to the attentions of your strange visitor, and incidentally have the opportunity of observing a most singular and interesting phenomenon." "What?" gasped Mrs. Maloney. "A phenomenon? You mean that you know what it is?" "I am quite certain I know what it is," he replied very low, for we heard the footsteps of Sangri approaching, "though I am not so certain yet as to the best means of dealing with it. But in any case it is not wise to leave precipitately." "Oh, Timothy, does he think it's a devil?" cried the bosun's mate in a voice that even the Canadian must have heard. "In my opinion," continued John Silence, looking across at me and the clergyman, "it is a case of modern lycanthropy with other complications that may—" He left the sentence unfinished, for Mrs. Maloney got up with a jump and fled to her tent, fearful she might hear a worse thing. And at that moment, Sangri turned the corner of the stockade and came into view. "There are footmarks all round the mouth of my tent," he said with excitement. "The animal has been here again in the night. Dr. Silence, you really must come and see them for yourself. They're as plain on the moss as tracks in snow." 294, but later in the day, while Sangri went off in the canoe to fish the pools near the larger islands, and Joan still lay, bandaged and resting, in her tent, Dr. Silence called me and the tutor, and proposed a walk to the granite slabs at the far end. Mrs. Maloney sat on a stump near her daughter, and busied herself energetically with alternate nursing and painting. "We'll leave you in charge," the doctor said with a smile that was meant to be encouraging, "and when you want us for lunch, or anything, the megaphone will always bring us back in time." For though the very air was charged with strange emotions, everyone talked quietly and naturally, as with a definite desire to counteract unnecessary excitement. "I'll keep watch," said the plucky bosun's mate, "and meanwhile I find comfort in my work." She was busy with the sketch she had begun on the day after our arrival. "For even a tree," she added proudly, pointing to her little easel, "is a symbol of the divine, and the thought makes me feel safer." We glanced for a moment at a daub which was more like the symptom of a disease than a symbol of the divine, and then took the path round the lagoon. At the far end, we made a little fire, and lay round it in the shadow of a big boulder. Maloney stopped his humming suddenly, and turned to his companion. "And what do you make of it all?" he asked abruptly. "In the first place," replied John Silence, making himself comfortable against the rock, "it is of human origin, this animal, It is undoubted lycanthropy. His words had the effect precisely of a bombshell. Maloney listened, as though he had been struck. "You puzzle me utterly," he said, sitting up closer and staring at him. "Perhaps," replied the other, "but if you'll listen to me for a few moments you may be less puzzled at the end, or more. It depends how much you know. Let me go further and say that you have underestimated, or 295 miscalculated, the effect of this primitive wild life upon all of you." "In what way?" asked the clergyman, bristling a trifle. "It is strong medicine for any town dweller, and for some of you it has been too strong. One of you has gone wild." He uttered these last words with great emphasis. "Gone savage," he added, looking from one to the other. Neither of us found anything to reply. "To say that the brute has awakened in a man is not a mere metaphor always," he went on presently. "Of course not, but in the sense I mean may have a very literal and terrible significance," pursued Doctor. "Silence, ancient instincts that no one dreamed of, least of all their possessor, may leap forth. Atavism can hardly explain a roaming animal with teeth and claws and sanguinary instincts," interrupted Maloney with impatience. "The term is of your own choice," continued the doctor equably, "not mine, and it is a good example of a word that indicates a result while it conceals the process. But the explanation of this beast that haunts your island and attacks your daughter is of far deeper significance than mere atavistic tendencies, or throwing back to animal origin, which I suppose is the thought in your mind. You spoke just now of lycanthropy," said Maloney, looking bewildered and anxious to keep to plain facts evidently. "I think I have come across the word, but really, it can have no actual significance. Today, can it? These superstitions of medieval times can hardly." He looked round at me with his jolly red face, and the expression of astonishment and dismay on it would have made me shout with laughter at any other time. Laughter, however, was never farther from my mind than at this moment when I listened to Doctor. Silence, as he carefully 296 suggested to the clergyman the very explanation that had gradually been forcing itself upon my own mind. "However medieval ideas may have exaggerated, the idea is not of much importance to us now," he said quietly, "when we are face to face with a modern example of what, I take it, has always been a profound fact. For the moment let us leave the name of anyone in particular out of the matter and consider certain possibilities. We all agreed with that at any rate. There was no need to speak of Sangri or of anyone else until we knew a little more. The fundamental fact in this most curious case," he went on, "is that the double of a man—" "You mean the astral body?" "I've heard of that, of course," broke in Maloney with a snort of triumph. "No doubt," said the other, smiling, "no doubt you have. That this double or fluidic body of a man, as I was saying, has the power under certain conditions of projecting itself and becoming visible to others. Certain training will accomplish this, and certain drugs likewise. Illnesses, too, that ravage the body may produce temporarily the result that death produces permanently, and let loose this counterpart of a human being and render it visible to the sight of others. Everyone, of course, knows this more or less today, but it is not so generally known, and probably believed by none who have not witnessed it, that this fluidic body can, under certain conditions, assume other forms than human, and that such other forms may be determined by the dominating thought and wish of the owner. For this double or astral body, as you call it, is really the seat of the passions, emotions, and desires in the psychical economy. It is the passion body, and in projecting itself, it can often assume a form that gives expression to the overmastering desire that molds it, for it is composed of such tenuous matter that it lends itself readily to the molding by thought and wish. 297, I follow you perfectly, said Maloney, looking as if he would much rather be chopping firewood elsewhere and singing. And there are some persons so constituted, the doctor went on with increasing seriousness, that the fluid body in them is but loosely associated with the physical persons of poor health as a rule, yet often of strong desires and passions, and in these persons it is easy for the double to dissociate itself during deep sleep from their system, and, driven forth by some consuming desire, to assume an animal form and seek the fulfillment of that desire. There, in broad daylight, I saw Maloney deliberately creep closer to the fire and heap the wood on. We gathered into the heat and to each other and listened to Dr. Silence's voice as it mingled with the swish and whir of the wind about us and the falling of the little waves. For instance, to take a concrete example, he resumed, suppose some young man, with the delicate constitution I have spoken of, forms an overpowering attachment to a young woman, yet perceives that it is not welcomed, and is man enough to repress its outward manifestations. In such a case, supposing his double be easily projected, the very repression of his love in the daytime would add to the intense force of his desire when released in deep sleep from the control of his will, and his fluidic body might issue forth in monstrous or animal shape and become actually visible to others. And if his devotion were dog-like in its fidelity, yet concealing the fires of a fierce passion beneath, it might well assume the form of a creature that seemed to be half dog, half wolf. "A werewolf, you mean?" cried Maloney, pale to the lips as he listened. John's silence held up a restraining hand. "A werewolf," he said, "is a true psychical fact of profound significance, however absurdly it may have been exaggerated by the imaginations of a superstitious peasantry in the days of 298 unenlightenment. For a werewolf is nothing but the savage, and possibly sanguinary, instincts of a passionate man scouring the world in his fluidic body, his passion body, his body of desire. As in the case at hand, he may not know it. It is not necessarily deliberate then." Maloney put in quickly with relief. "It is hardly ever deliberate. It is the desires released in sleep, from the control of the will finding a vent. In all savage races it has been recognized and dreaded, this phenomenon styled werewolf, but today it is rare, and it is becoming rarer still, for the world grows tame and civilized, emotions have become refined, desires lukewarm, and few men have savagery enough left in them to generate impulses of such intense force, and certainly not to project them in animal form. By Gad!" exclaimed the clergyman breathlessly and with increasing excitement, "then I feel I must tell you, what has been given to me in confidence, that Sangri has in him an admixture of savage blood, of Red Indian ancestry. Let us stick to our supposition of a man as described." The doctor stopped him calmly. "And let us imagine that he has in him this admixture of savage blood, and further, that he is wholly unaware of his dreadful physical and psychical infirmity, and that he suddenly finds himself leading the primitive life together with the object of his desires, with the result that the strain of the untamed wild man in his blood, Red Indian, for instance, from Maloney." "Red Indian, perfectly," agreed the doctor. "The result, I say, that this savage strain in him is awakened and leaps into passionate life." "What then?" He looked hard at Timothy Maloney, and the clergyman looked hard at him. "The wild life such as you lead here on this island, for instance, might quickly awaken his savage instincts, his buried instincts, and with profoundly disquieting results. 299, you mean his subtle body, as you call it, might issue forth automatically in deep sleep and seek the object of its desire," I said, coming to Maloney's aid, who was finding it more and more difficult to get words. "Precisely, yet the desire of the man remaining utterly unmalefic, pure and wholesome in every sense." "Ah," I heard the clergyman gasp, "the lover's desire for union run wild, run savage, tearing its way out in primitive, untamed fashion, I mean," continued the doctor, striving to make himself clear to a mind bounded by conventional thought and knowledge. "For the desire to possess, remember, may easily become importunate, and embodied in this animal form of the subtle body which acts as its vehicle, may go forth to tear in pieces all that obstructs, to reach to the very heart of the loved object and seize it. Au fond, it is nothing more than the aspiration for union, as I said, the splendid and perfectly clean desire to absorb utterly into itself." He paused a moment and looked into Maloney's eyes. "To bathe in the very heart's blood of the one desired," he added with grave emphasis. The fire spurted and crackled and made me start, but Maloney found relief in a genuine shudder, and I saw him turn his head and look about him from the sea to the trees. The wind dropped just at that moment, and the doctor's words rang sharply through the stillness. "Then it might even kill," stammered the clergyman presently in a hushed voice, and with a little forced laugh by way of protest that sounded quite ghastly. "In the last resort it might kill," repeated Doctor. Silence. Then, after another pause, during which he was clearly debating how much or how little it was wise to give to his audience, he continued, "And if the double does not succeed in getting back to its physical body, that physical body would wake an imbecile, an idiot, or perhaps never wake at all." Maloney sat up and found his tongue. 300, you mean that if this fluid animal thing, or whatever it is, should be prevented getting back, the man might never wake again?" he asked with shaking voice. "He might be dead," replied the other calmly. The tremor of a positive sensation shivered in the air about us. "Then isn't that the best way to cure the fool, the brute?" thundered the clergyman, half rising to his feet. "Certainly it would be an easy and undiscoverable form of murder," was the stern reply, spoken as calmly as though it were a remark about the weather. Maloney collapsed visibly, and I gathered the wood over the fire and coaxed up a blaze. The greater part of the man's life, of his vital forces, goes out with this double, doctor. Silence resumed, after a moment's consideration, and a considerable portion of the actual material of his physical body. So the physical body that remains behind is depleted, not only of force, but of matter. You would see it small, shrunken, drop together, just like the body of a materializing medium at a seance. Moreover, any mark or injury inflicted upon this double will be found exactly reproduced by the phenomenon of repercussion upon the shrunken physical body lying in its trance. An injury inflicted upon the one you say would be reproduced also on the other, repeated Maloney, his excitement growing again. Undoubtedly, replied the other quietly, for there exists all the time a continuous connection between the physical body and the double, a connection of matter, though of exceedingly attenuated, possibly of etheric matter. The wound travels, so to speak, from one to the other, and if this connection were broken, the result would be death. Death, repeated Maloney to himself, death. He looked anxiously at our faces, his thoughts evidently beginning to clear. And this solidity, he asked presently after a general pause, this tearing of tents and flesh, this howling and 301 the marks of pause. You mean that the double has sufficient material drawn from the depleted body to produce physical results? Certainly, the doctor took him up, although to explain at this moment such problems as the passage of matter through matter would be as difficult as to explain how the thought of a mother can actually break the bones of the child unborn. Doctor, silence pointed out to sea, and Maloney, looking wildly about him, turned with a violent start. I saw a canoe, with Sangri in the stern seat, slowly coming into view round the farther point. His hat was off, and his tanned face for the first time appeared to me, to us all, I think, as though it were the face of someone else. He looked like a wild man. Then he stood up in the canoe to make a cast with the rod, and he looked for all the world like an Indian. I recalled the expression of his face, as I had seen it once or twice, notably on that occasion of the evening prayer, and an involuntary shudder ran down my spine. At that very instant he turned and saw us where we lay, and his face broke into a smile, so that his teeth showed white in the sun. He looked in his element, and exceedingly attractive. He called out something about his fish, and soon after passed out of sight into the lagoon. For a time none of us said a word. And the cure, ventured Maloney at length, is not to quench this savage force, replied Doctor. Silence, but to steer it better, and to provide other outlets. This is the solution of all these problems of accumulated force, for this force is the raw material of usefulness, and should be increased and cherished, not by separating it from the body by death, but by raising it to higher channels. The best and quickest cure of all, he went on, speaking very gently and with a hand upon the clergyman's arm, is to lead it towards its object, provided that object is not unalterably hostile, to let it find rest where. He stopped abruptly, and the eyes of the two men met in a single glance of comprehension. 302, Joan, Maloney exclaimed under his breath. Joan, replied John Silence. We all went to bed early. The day had been unusually warm, and after sunset, a curious hush descended on the island. Nothing was audible but that faint, ghostly singing which is inseparable from a pinewood even on the stillest day. A low, searching sound, as though the wind had hair and trailed it o'er the world. With the sudden cooling of the atmosphere, a sea fog began to form. It appeared in isolated patches over the water, and then these patches slid together, and a white wall advanced upon us. Not a breath of air stirred. The firs stood like flat metal outlines. The sea became as oil. The whole scene lay as though held motionless by some huge weight in the air, and the flames from our fire, the largest we had ever made, rose upwards, straight as a church steeple. As I followed the rest of our party tentwards, having kicked the embers of the fire into safety, the advance guard of the fog was creeping slowly among the trees, like white arms feeling their way. Mingled with the smoke was the odor of moss and soil and bark, and the peculiar flavor of the Baltic, half salt, half brackish, like the smell of an estuary at low water. It is difficult to say why it seemed to me that this deep stillness masked an intense activity. Perhaps in every mood lies the suggestion of its opposite, so that I became aware of the contrast of furious energy, for it was like moving through the deep pause before a thunderstorm, and I trod gently lest by breaking a twig or moving a stone, I might set the whole scene into some sort of tumultuous movement. Actually, no doubt, it was nothing more than a result of overstrung nerves. There was no more question of undressing, and going to bed than there was of undressing and going to bathe. Some sense in me was alert and expectant. I sat in my 303 tent and waited, and at the end of half an hour or so, my waiting was justified, for the canvas suddenly shivered, and someone tripped over the ropes that held it to the earth. John's silence came in. The effect of his quiet entry was singular and prophetic. It was just as though the energy lying behind all this stillness had pressed forward to the edge of action. This, no doubt, was merely the quickening of my own mind, and had no other justification, for the presence of John's silence always suggested the near possibility of vigorous action, and as a matter of fact, he came in with nothing more than a nod and a significant gesture. He sat down on a corner of my ground sheet, and I pushed the blanket over so that he could cover his legs. He drew the flap of the tent after him and settled down, but hardly had he done so when the canvas shook a second time, and in blundered Maloney. "Sitting in the dark," he said self-consciously, pushing his head inside and hanging up his lantern on the ridgepole nail. "I just looked in for a smoke, I suppose." He glanced round, caught the eye of Doctor. Silence and stopped. He put his pipe back into his pocket and began to hum softly, that underbreath humming of a nondescript melody I knew so well and had come to hate. Doctor. Silence leaned forward, opened the lantern and blew the light out. "Speak low," he said, "and don't strike matches. Listen for sounds and movements about the camp, and be ready to follow me at a moment's notice." There was light enough to distinguish our faces easily, and I saw Maloney glance again hurriedly at both of us. "Is the camp asleep?" the doctor asked presently, whispering. "Sangry is," replied the clergyman, in a voice equally low. "I can't answer for the women. I think they're sitting up. That's for the best." And then he added, "I wish the fog would thin a bit and let the moon through. Later we may want it." 304, it is lifting now, I think, Maloney whispered back. "It's over the tops of the trees already." I cannot say what it was in this commonplace exchange of remarks that thrilled. Probably Maloney's swift acquiescence in the doctor's mood had something to do with it, for his quick obedience certainly impressed me a good deal. But even without that slight evidence, it was clear that each recognized the gravity of the occasion and understood that sleep was impossible and sentry duty was the order of the night. "Report to me," repeated John's silence once again, "the least sound, and do nothing precipitately." He shifted across to the mouth of the tent and raised the flap, fastening it against the pole so that he could see out. Maloney stopped humming and began to force the breath through his teeth with a kind of faint hissing, treating us to a medley of church hymns and popular songs of the day. Then the tent trembled as though someone had touched it. "That's the wind rising," whispered the clergyman, and pulled the flap open as far as it would go. A waft of cold, damp air entered and made us shiver, and with it came a sound of the sea as the first wave washed its way softly along the shores. "It's got round to the north," he added, and following his voice came a long-drawn whisper that rose from the whole island as the trees sent forth a sighing response. "The fog'll move a bit now. I can make out a lane across the sea already." "Hush," said Doctor. Silence, for Maloney's voice had risen above a whisper, and we settled down again to another long period of watching and waiting, broken only by the occasional rubbing of shoulders against the canvas as we shifted our positions, and the increasing noise of waves on the outer coastline of the island, and over all word the murmur of wind sweeping the tops of the trees like a 305 great harp, and the faint tapping on the tent as drops fell from the branches with a sharp pinging sound. We had sat for something over an hour in this way, and Maloney and I were finding it increasingly hard to keep awake, when suddenly Doctor Silence rose to his feet and peered out. The next minute he was gone, relieved of the dominating presence. The clergyman thrust his face close into mine. "I don't much care for this waiting game," he whispered, "but Silence wouldn't hear of my sitting up with the others. He said it would prevent anything happening if I did." "He knows," I answered shortly. "No doubt in the world about that," he whispered back. "It's this double business, as he calls it, or else it's obsession as the Bible describes it. But it's bad, whichever it is, and I've got my Winchester outside ready cocked, and I brought this too." He shoved a pocket Bible under my nose. At one time in his life, it had been his inseparable companion. "One's useless and the other's dangerous," I replied under my breath, conscious of a keen desire to laugh and leaving him to choose. "Safety lies in following our leader. I'm not thinking of myself," he interrupted sharply. "Only, if anything happens to Joan tonight, I'm going to shoot first and pray afterwards." Maloney put the book back into his hip pocket and peered out of the doorway. "What is he up to now, in the devil's name, I wonder?" he added, going round Sangri's tent and making gestures. "How weird he looks disappearing in and out of the fog." "Just trust him and wait," I said quickly, for the doctor was already on his way back. "Remember, he has the knowledge and knows what he's about. I've been with him through worse cases than this." Maloney moved back as Doctor Silence darkened the doorway and stooped to enter. 306, his sleep is very deep, he whispered, seating himself by the door again. "He's in a cataleptic condition, and the double may be released any minute now. But I've taken steps to imprison it in the tent, and it can't get out till I permit it. Be on the watch for signs of movement." Then he looked hard at Maloney. "But no violence or shooting, remember, Mr. Maloney, unless you want a murder on your hands. Anything done to the double acts by repercussion upon the physical body. You had better take out the cartridges at once." His voice was stern. The clergyman went out, and I heard him emptying the magazine of his rifle. When he returned, he sat nearer the door than before, and from that moment until we left the tent, he never once took his eyes from the figure of Doctor Silence silhouetted there against sky and canvas. And meanwhile, the wind came steadily over the sea and opened the mist into lanes and clearings, driving it about like a living thing. It must have been well after midnight when a low booming sound drew my attention. But at first, the sense of hearing was so strained that it was impossible exactly to locate it, and I imagined it was the thunder of big guns far out at sea carried to us by the rising wind. Then Maloney, catching hold of my arm and leaning forward, somehow brought the true relation, and I realized the next second that it was only a few feet away. "Sangri's tent," he exclaimed in a loud and startled whisper. I craned my head round the corner, but at first the effect of the fog was so confusing that every patch of white driving about before the wind looked like a moving tent, and it was some seconds before I discovered the one patch that held steady. Then I saw that it was shaking all over, and the sides, flapping as much as the tightness of the ropes allowed, were the cause of the booming sound we had heard. Something alive was tearing frantically about inside, banging against the stretched canvas in a 307 way that made me think of a great moth dashing against the walls and ceiling of a room. The tent bulged and rocked. "It's trying to get out, by Jupiter," muttered the clergyman, rising to his feet and turning to the side where the unloaded rifle lay. I sprang up too, hardly knowing what purpose was in my mind, but anxious to be prepared for anything. John Silence, however, was before us both, and his figure slipped past and blocked the doorway of the tent, and there was some quality in his voice next minute, when he began to speak, that brought our minds instantly to a state of calm obedience. "First, the women's tent," he said low, looking sharply at Maloney, "and if I need your help, I'll call." The clergyman needed no second bidding. He dived past me and was out in a moment. He was laboring evidently under intense excitement. I watched him picking his way silently over the slippery ground, giving the moving tent a wide berth, and presently disappearing among the floating shapes of fog. "Doctor," Silence turned to me. "You heard those footsteps about half an hour ago?" he asked significantly. I heard nothing. They were extraordinarily soft, almost the soundless tread of a wild creature. "But now, follow me closely," he added, "for we must waste no time if I am to save this poor man from his affliction and lead his werewolf double to its rest. And unless I am much mistaken," he peered at me through the darkness, whispering with the utmost distinctness, "Joan and Sangri are absolutely made for one another, and I think she knows it too, just as well as he does." My head swam a little as I listened, but at the same time something cleared in my brain and I saw that he was right. Yet it was all so weird and incredible, so remote from the commonplace facts of life as commonplace people know them. And more than once it flashed upon me that the whole scene, people, words, tents, and all 308 the rest of it, were delusions created by the intense excitement of my own mind somehow, and that suddenly the sea fog would clear off and the world become normal again. The cold air from the sea stung our cheeks sharply as we left the close atmosphere of the little crowded tent. The sighing of the trees, the waves breaking below on the rocks, and the lines and patches of mist driving about us seemed to create the momentary illusion that the whole island had broken loose and was floating out to sea like a mighty raft. The doctor moved just ahead of me, quickly and silently. He was making straight for the Canadian's tent, where the sides still boomed and shook as the creature of sinister life raced and tore about impatiently within. A little distance from the door, he paused, and held up a hand to stop me. We were perhaps a dozen feet away. "Before I release it, you shall see for yourself," he said, "that the reality of the werewolf is beyond all question. The matter of which it is composed is, of course, exceedingly attenuated, but you are partially clairvoyant, and even if it is not dense enough for normal sight, you will see something." He added a little more I could not catch. The fact was that the curiously strong vibrating atmosphere surrounding his person somewhat confused my senses. It was the result, of course, of his intense concentration of mind and forces, and pervaded the entire camp and all the persons in it. And as I watched the canvas shake and heard it boom and flap, I heartily welcomed it, for it was also protective. At the back of Sangri's tent stood a thin group of pine trees, but in front and at the sides the ground was comparatively clear. The flap was wide open, and any ordinary animal would have been out and away without the least trouble. "Doctor," Silence led me up to within a few feet, evidently careful not to advance beyond a certain limit, and then stooped down and signaled to me to do 309 the same. And looking over his shoulder, I saw the interior lit faintly by the spectral light reflected from the fog, and the dim blot upon the balsam boughs and blankets signifying Sangri, while over him, and round him, and up and down him, flew the dark mass of something on 4 legs, with pointed muzzle and sharp ears plainly visible against the tent sides, and the occasional gleam of fiery eyes and white fangs. I held my breath and kept utterly still, inwardly and outwardly, for fear, I suppose, that the creature would become conscious of my presence. But the distress I felt went far deeper than the mere sense of personal safety, or the fact of watching something so incredibly active and real. I became keenly aware of the dreadful psychic calamity it involved. The realization that Sangri lay confined in that narrow space with this species of monstrous projection of himself, that he was wrapped there in the cataleptic sleep, all unconscious that this thing was masquerading with his own life and energies, added a distressing touch of horror to the scene. In all the cases of John's silence, and they were many and often terrible, no other psychic affliction has ever, before or since, impressed me so convincingly with the pathetic impermanence of the human personality, with its fluid nature, and with the alarming possibilities of its transformations. "Come," he whispered, after we had watched for some minutes the frantic efforts to escape from the circle of thought and will that held it prisoner, "come a little farther away while I release it." We moved back a dozen yards or so. It was like a scene in some impossible play, or in some ghastly and oppressive nightmare from which I should presently awake to find the blankets all heaped up upon my chest. By some method undoubtedly mental, but which, in my confusion and excitement, I failed to understand, the doctor accomplished his purpose, and the next minute I 310 heard him say sharply under his breath, "It's out. Now watch." At this very moment, a sudden gust from the sea blew aside the mist, so that a lane opened to the sky, and the moon, ghastly and unnatural as the effect of stage limelight, dropped down in a momentary gleam upon the door of Sangri's tent, and I perceived that something had moved forward from the interior darkness and stood clearly defined upon the threshold. And at the same moment, the tent ceased its shuddering and held still. There in the doorway stood an animal, with neck and muzzle thrust forward, its head poking into the night, its whole body poised in that attitude of intense rigidity that precedes the spring into freedom, the running leap of attack. It seemed to be about the size of a calf, leaner than a mastiff, yet more squat than a wolf, and I can swear that I saw the fur ridged sharply upon its back. Then its upper lip slowly lifted, and I saw the whiteness of its teeth. Surely no human being ever stared as hard as I did in those next few minutes. Yet the harder I stared, the clearer appeared the amazing and monstrous apparition. For after all it was Sangri, and yet it was not Sangri. It was the head and face of an animal, and yet it was the face of Sangri, the face of a wild dog, a wolf, and yet his face. The eyes were sharper, narrower, more fiery, yet they were his eyes run wild. The teeth were longer, wider, more pointed, yet they were his teeth grown cruel. The expression was flaming, terrible, exultant, yet it was his expression carried to the border of savagery. His expression, as I had already surprised it more than once, only dominant now, fully released from human constraint, with the mad yearning of a hungry and importunate soul. It was the soul of Sangri, the long-suppressed, deeply loving Sangri, expressed in its single and intense desire, pure, utterly and utterly wonderful. Yet at the same time came the feeling that it was all an illusion. I suddenly remembered the extraordinary 311 changes the human face can undergo in circular insanity, when it changes from melancholia to elation, and I recalled the effect of hashish, which shows the human countenance in the form of the bird or animal to which in character it most approximates. And for a moment, I attributed this mingling of Sangri's face with a wolf to some kind of similar delusion of the senses. I was mad, deluded, dreaming. The excitement of the day, and this dim light of stars and bewildering mist combined to trick me. I had been amazingly imposed upon by some false wizardry of the senses. It was all absurd and fantastic. It would pass. And then, sounding across this sea of mental confusion like a bell through a fog, came the voice of John Silence, bringing me back to a consciousness of the reality of it all, Sangri, in his double. And when I looked again more calmly, I plainly saw that it was indeed the face of the Canadian, but his face turned animal, yet mingled with the brute expression a curiously pathetic look, like the soul seen sometimes in the yearning eyes of a dog, the face of an animal shot, with vivid streaks of the human. The doctor called to him softly under his breath, "Sangri, Sangri, you poor afflicted creature, do you know me? Can you understand what it is you're doing in your body of desire?" For the first time since its appearance, the creature moved. Its ears twitched, and it shifted the weight of its body onto the hind legs. Then, lifting its head and muzzle to the sky, it opened its long jaws and gave vent to a dismal and prolonged howling. But when I heard that howling rise to heaven, the breath caught and strangled in my throat, and it seemed that my heart missed a beat, for though the sound was entirely animal, it was at the same time entirely human. But more than that, it was the cry I had so often heard in 312, the western states of America, where the Indians still fight and hunt and struggle. It was the cry of the redskin. "The Indian blood," whispered John Silence when I caught his arm for support. "The ancestral cry." And that poignant, beseeching cry, that broken human voice, mingling with the savage howl of the brute beast, pierced straight to my very heart and touched there something that no music, no voice, passionate or tender, of man, woman, or child has ever stirred before or since for 1 second into life. It echoed away among the fog and the trees, and lost itself somewhere out over the hidden sea. And some part of myself, something that was far more than the mere act of intense listening, went out with it, and for several minutes I lost consciousness of my surroundings and felt utterly absorbed in the pain of another stricken fellow creature. Again the voice of John Silence recalled me to myself. "Hark," he said aloud. "Hark." His tone galvanized me afresh. We stood listening side by side. Far across the island, faintly sounding through the trees and brushwood, came a similar, answering cry, shrill yet wonderfully musical, shaking the heart with a singular wild sweetness that defies description. We heard it rise and fall upon the night air. "It's across the lagoon, Doctor," Silence cried, but this time in full tones that paid no tribute to caution. "It's Joan. She's answering him." Again the wonderful cry rose and fell, and that same instant the animal lowered its head, and muzzle to earth, set off on a swift, easy canter that took it off into the mist, and out of our sight like a thing of wind and vision. The doctor made a quick dash to the door of Sangri's tent, and following close at his heels, I peered in and caught a momentary glimpse of the small, shrunken body lying upon the branches, but half covered by the blankets, the cage from which most of the life, and not a little of the actual corporeal substance, had escaped into 313, that other form of life and energy, the body of passion and desire, by another of those swift, incalculable processes which at this stage of my apprenticeship I failed often to grasp. Doctor Silence reclosed the circle about the tent and body. "Now it cannot return till I permit it," he said, and the next second was off at full speed into the woods, with myself close behind him. I had already had some experience of my companion's ability to run swiftly through a dense wood, and I now had the further proof of his power almost to see in the dark. For once we left the open space about the tents, the trees seemed to absorb all the remaining vestiges of light, and I understood that special sensibility that is said to develop in the blind, the sense of obstacles. And twice as we ran, we heard the sound of that dismal howling drawing nearer and nearer to the answering faint cry from the point of the island whither we were going. Then suddenly the trees fell away, and we emerged, hot and breathless, upon the rocky point where the granite slabs ran bare into the sea. It was like passing into the clearness of open day, and there, sharply defined against sea and sky, stood the figure of a human being. It was Joan. I at once saw that there was something about her appearance that was singular and unusual, but it was only when we had moved quite close that I recognized what caused it. For while the lips wore a smile that lit the whole face with a happiness I had never seen there before, the eyes themselves were fixed in a steady, sightless stare as though they were lifeless and made of glass. I made an impulsive forward movement, but Doctor Silence instantly dragged me back. "No," he cried, "don't wake her. What do you mean?" I replied aloud, struggling in his grasp. "She's asleep. It's somnambulistic. The shock might injure her permanently." 314, I turned and peered closely into his face. He was absolutely calm. I began to understand a little more, catching, I suppose, something of his strong thinking. "Walking in her sleep, you mean?" He nodded. "She's on her way to meet him. From the very beginning he must have drawn her irresistibly. But the torn tent and the wounded flesh, when she did not sleep deep enough to enter the somnambulistic trance he missed her, he went instinctively and in all innocence to seek her out, with the result, of course, that she woke and was terrified. Then in their heart of hearts they love?" I asked finally. John Silence smiled his inscrutable smile. "Profoundly," he answered, "and as simply as only primitive souls can love. If only they both come to realize it in their normal waking states, his double will cease these nocturnal excursions. He will be cured and at rest." The words had hardly left his lips when there was a sound of rustling branches on our left, and the very next instant the dense brushwood parted where it was darkest, and out rushed the swift form of an animal at full gallop. The noise of feet was scarcely audible, but in that utter stillness I heard the heavy panting breath and caught the swish of the low bushes against its sides. It went straight towards Joan, and as it went the girl lifted her head and turned to meet it. And the same instant, a canoe that had been creeping silently and unobserved round the inner shore of the lagoon emerged from the shadows and defined itself upon the water with a figure at the middle thwart. It was Maloney. It was only afterwards I realized that we were invisible to him where we stood against the dark background of trees. The figures of Joan and the animal he saw plainly, but not Doctor Silence and myself, standing just beyond them. He stood up in the canoe and pointed with his right arm. I saw something gleam in his hand. "Stand aside, Joan girl, or you'll get hit," he shouted, his voice ringing horribly through the deep stillness. And the 315 same instant a pistol shot cracked out with a burst of flame and smoke, and the figure of the animal, with one tremendous leap into the air, fell back in the shadows and disappeared like a shape of night and fog. Instantly, then, Joan opened her eyes, looked in a dazed fashion about her, and pressing both hands against her heart, fell with a sharp cry into my arms that were just in time to catch her, and an answering cry sounded across the lagoon, thin, wailing, piteous. It came from Sangri's tent. "Fool," cried Doctor Silence, "you've wounded him." And before we could move or realize quite what it meant, he was in the canoe and halfway across the lagoon. Some kind of similar abuse came in a torrent from my lips, too, though I cannot remember the actual words, as I cursed the man for his disobedience and tried to make the girl comfortable on the ground. But the clergyman was more practical. He was spreading his coat over her and dashing water on her face. "It's not Joan I've killed at any rate," I heard him mutter as she turned and opened her eyes and smiled faintly up in his face. "I swear the bullet went straight." Joan stared at him. She was still dazed and bewildered, and still imagined herself with the companion of her trance. The strange lucidity of the somnambulist still hung over her brain and mind, though outwardly she appeared troubled and confused. "Where has he gone to? He disappeared so suddenly, crying that he was hurt," she asked, looking at her father as though she did not recognize him. "And if they've done anything to him, they have done it to me too, for he is more to me than—" Her words grew vaguer and vaguer as she returned slowly to her normal waking state, and now she stopped altogether, as though suddenly aware that she had been surprised into telling secrets. But all the way back, as we carried her carefully through the trees, the girl smiled and murmured Sangri's name and asked if he was injured, until it finally became clear to me that the wild soul of the 316 one had called to the wild soul of the other, and in the secret depths of their beings the call had been heard and understood. John Silence was right. In the abyss of her heart, too deep at first for recognition, the girl loved him and had loved him from the very beginning. Once her normal waking consciousness recognized the fact they would leap together like twin flames, and his affliction would be at an end. His intense desire would be satisfied. He would be cured. And in Sangri's tent, Doctor Silence and I sat up for the remainder of the night, this wonderful and haunted night that had shown us such strange glimpses of a new heaven and a new hell. For the Canadian tossed upon his balsam boughs with high fever in his blood, and upon each cheek a dark and curious contusion showed, throbbing with severe pain, although the skin was not broken, and there was no outward and visible sign of blood. "Maloney shot straight, you see," whispered Doctor Silence to me after the clergyman had gone to his tent and had put Joan to sleep beside her mother, who, by the way, had never once awakened. "The bullet must have passed clean through the face, for both cheeks are stained. He'll wear these marks all his life, smaller but always there. They are the most curious scars in the world, these scars transferred by repercussion from an injured double. They'll remain visible until just before his death, and then with the withdrawal of the subtle body they will disappear finally." His words mingled in my dazed mind with the sighs of the troubled sleeper and the crying of the wind about the tent. Nothing seemed to paralyze my powers of realization so much as these twin stains of mysterious significance upon the face before me. It was odd, too, how speedily and easily the camp resigned itself again to sleep and quietness, as though a stage curtain had suddenly dropped down upon the action and concealed it. And nothing contributed so vividly to the 317 feeling that I had been a spectator of some kind of visionary drama as the dramatic nature of the change in the girl's attitude. Yet, as a matter of fact, the change had not been so sudden and revolutionary as appeared. Underneath, in those remoter regions of consciousness where the emotions, unknown to their owners, do secretly mature, and owe thence their abrupt revelation to some abrupt psychological climax, there can be no doubt that Joan's love for the Canadian had been growing steadily and irresistibly all the time. It had now rushed to the surface so that she recognized it. That was all. And it has always seemed to me that the presence of John Silence, so potent, so quietly efficacious, produced an effect, if one may say so, of a psychic forcing house, and hastened incalculably the bringing together of these two wild lovers. In that sudden awakening had occurred the very psychological climax required to reveal the passionate emotion accumulated below. The deeper knowledge had leaped across and transferred itself to her ordinary consciousness, and in that shock, the collision of the personalities had shaken them to the depths and shown her the truth beyond all possibility of doubt. "He's sleeping quietly now," the doctor said, interrupting my reflections. "If you will watch alone for a bit, I'll go to Maloney's tent and help him to arrange his thoughts." He smiled in anticipation of that arrangement. He'll never quite understand how a wound on the double can transfer itself to the physical body, but at least I can persuade him that the less he talks and explains tomorrow, the sooner the forces will run their natural course now to peace and quietness. He went away softly, and with the removal of his present sangré, sleeping heavily, turned over and groaned with the pain of his broken head. And it was in the still hour just before the dawn, when all the islands were hushed, the wind and sea still dreaming, and the stars visible through clearing mists, 318, that a figure crept silently over the ridge and reached the door of the tent where I dozed beside the sufferer before I was aware of its presence. The flap was cautiously lifted a few inches, and in looked Joan. That same instant Sangré woke and sat up on his bed of branches. He recognized her before I could say a word and uttered a low cry. It was pain and joy mingled, and this time all human, and the girl too was no longer walking in her sleep, but fully aware of what she was doing. I was only just able to prevent him springing from his blankets. "Joan, Joan," he cried, and in a flash she answered him. "I'm here, I'm with you always now," and had pushed past me into the tent and flung herself upon his breast. "I knew you would come to me in the end," I heard him whisper. "It was all too big for me to understand at first," she murmured, "and for a long time I was frightened, but not now." He cried louder. "You don't feel afraid now of anything that's in me?" "I fear nothing," she cried. "Nothing, nothing." I led her outside again. She looked steadily into my face with eyes shining, and her whole being transformed. In some intuitive way, surviving probably from the somnambulism, she knew or guessed as much as I knew. "You must talk tomorrow with John Silence," I said gently, leading her towards her own tent. "He understands everything." I left her at the door, and as I went back softly to take up my place of sentry again with the Canadian, I saw the first streaks of dawn lighting up the far rim of the sea behind the distant islands, and as though to emphasize the eternal closeness of comedy to tragedy, two small details rose out of the scene and impressed me so vividly that I remember them to this very day. For in the tent where I had just left Joan, all aquiver with her new happiness, there rose plainly to my ears the grotesque sounds of the boatswain's mate, 319, heavily snoring, oblivious of all things in heaven or hell. And from Maloney's tent, so still was the night, where I looked across and saw the lanterns glow, there came to me, through the trees, the monotonous rising and falling of a human voice that was beyond question the sound of a man praying to his God.